The platinum band hit the mahogany desk with a sharp click. Next to it, I placed the thermal paper. 12 weeks, a tiny heartbeat charted in black and white. Julian stared at the ultrasound, his brow furrowed in confusion. My father, Hector, did not look at the baby. His eyes dropped to the edge of the desk, locked on a blue financial folder resting just beneath Julian's wrist. The blood drained from Hector's face, leaving his skin the color of old ash. He was not afraid of a grandchild. He was terrified of that folder. That was the second I realized my canceled wedding was not a heartbreak. It was a crime scene. Welcome back to Aura Vengeance, where quiet facts always outspeak loud lies. If you have ever had to build a case against the people who are supposed to protect you, tell me your age in the comments and hit subscribe. Let us rewind 72 hours. My name is Eleanor Garcia. I am 31 years old and I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I work as a hospital compliance auditor. My days are spent sitting in fluorescent lit rooms, hunting down billing anomalies. I look for the missing decimal points and the shadow accounts that administrators try to bury in the fine print. On a Tuesday morning, I stood in my bathroom and watched 2 pink lines bloom across a plastic stick. Julian was in Denver for a real estate conference. We had spent a year trying to start a family, navigating the quiet grief of negative tests month after month. Holding that positive result felt like holding a fragile piece of glass. It was the first pure thing in a life spent managing my parents' endless crises. My mother Sylvia invited me to lunch that afternoon. I went, intending to practice my announcement. We met at a cafe near the plaza. She wore a tailored silk blouse and her signature silver jewelry. Before the waiter even brought our drinks, she leaned across the table and studied my face. "You have dark circles, Eleanor." She stirred her iced tea. "A woman with no children has zero excuse to look so exhausted. You need to put more effort into keeping Julian interested." I ran my thumb over the cold condensation on my water glass. I swallowed the news. I gave her a practiced, polite smile. It was easier to endure her casual insults than to share my joy and watch her appraise it. She viewed Julian as a walking networking opportunity for my father. She did not view him as my partner. What I did not know as I sat there drinking my water was that the trap was already set. They had already pulled Julian aside the night before he left for Denver. They had sat him down and fed him a calculated lie about my medical history. They told him I was genetically incapable of having children and that I was actively lying to trap him into marriage. They were orchestrating a betrayal that would sever my relationship overnight. And they did it all to keep a team of corporate wealth managers from looking too closely at my last name. I drove back to my apartment with the taste of lemon and ice water lingering on my tongue. The New Mexico sun cast long, sharp shadows across the adobe walls of my complex. Julian was supposed to be home by 5. I had spent the entire drive rehearsing the moment. I would wait until he unpacked his suitcase. I would pour 2 glasses of sparkling cider. I would hand him the small white box containing the ultrasound. I unlocked the front door and stepped onto the hardwood floor. The apartment was silent. The air conditioning hummed a low, steady drone. I walked into the kitchen and stopped. Sitting in the exact center of the white quartz island was a platinum engagement ring. Beside it rested his spare set of house keys. The metal caught the afternoon light, throwing a small, blinding glare across the counter. My chest tightened. A cold current pooled in my stomach. The ring was heavy. It was a vintage cut he had spent 6 months sourcing from a dealer in Chicago. He never took it off my finger. He never let it sit on cold stone. Before I could reach out to touch the metal, my cell phone vibrated in my purse. Julian. I answered it, bringing the speaker to my ear. I expected to hear background noise, the sound of traffic, or an airport terminal. Instead, I heard nothing but the dead quiet of a sealed car interior. "Julian," I said. My voice shook. "You left your ring." "I am not coming back, Eleanor." His voice did not sound angry. It sounded hollow. It carried the sterile, clipped cadence of a corporate merger falling through. He spoke to me like a bad investment. He told me he was canceling the wedding. He did not pause to let the words settle. He just kept speaking in that flat, measured tone, citing irreconcilable omissions regarding my health. I asked him what he meant. My hand gripped the edge of the quartz counter. "Your parents sat me down last night," he said. The words dropped like stones into a well. "They came to my hotel in Denver. They were in tears, Eleanor. They told me everything you forced them to hide. They told me you have known since you were 17 that you are permanently infertile. They told me you fabricated this entire future to trap me into a marriage." The air in the kitchen turned thin. My lungs forgot how to draw a breath. I tried to speak. I tried to tell him that I was literally carrying a child right now. I tried to tell him about the plastic stick and the tiny charted heartbeat in my purse. "Do not lie to me anymore," he said. The ice in his tone cracked, revealing a deep, raw disgust. "Your mother showed me the medical file. I have seen the surgical records. I left the ring. I am going to your parents' house to collect my investment portfolios from Ector. Do not contact me." The line clicked dead. I stood in the silent kitchen. A baby was growing inside me, and my fiancé had just vanished into thin air based on a ghost story. What medical file? My mind snapped back to Tuesday. Sylvia had dropped by unannounced while I was at work. She claimed she wanted to bring over a box of my old college sweaters she found in the attic. Julian had been working from home that day. She must have planted it then. I walked down the hall to the guest bedroom. The cardboard box sat in the corner. I dropped to my knees and pulled the heavy wool sweaters out, tossing them onto the floor. At the very bottom, hidden beneath a layer of tissue paper, was a thick brown manila envelope. No return address, just my name written in black marker. I tore the flap open. Inside were a dozen pages of medical records. The letterhead belonged to a pediatric gynecology clinic in Albuquerque. The pages were filled with clinical notes detailing severe pelvic inflammatory disease. The surgical reports described extensive scarring and permanent ovarian damage. The final page featured a signature from a doctor I had never met, alongside a typed prognosis stating natural conception was biologically impossible. The paper felt slightly rough. The edges were worn. It looked incredibly real. Panic is a physical sensation. It starts behind the eyes and floods the nervous system with static. I sat on the floor, pressing a hand to my flat stomach. I read the clinical descriptions again. My vision blurred. Was the pregnancy test a false positive? Was it a tumor, an ectopic pregnancy? The psychological violence of making a woman question the reality of her own body is profound. This was Sylvia executing her signature maneuver. Plant a seed of doubt so deep the victim destroys herself before ever looking at the perpetrator. For one terrifying hour, I sat in the dust of the guest room, wondering if I had repressed a traumatic teenage diagnosis. Then the tears stopped. The panic receded. The hospital compliance auditor woke up. I gathered the scattered pages from the floor and carried them to the dining table. I turned on the overhead light. I spread the documents out edge to edge, aligning them in chronological order. I stopped being a terrified daughter. I became a professional looking for a structural flaw. I looked at the header. The clinic address listed a zip code with a 4-digit extension. I pulled up my laptop and cross-referenced the postal zone. The Postal Service did not assign that specific extension to that Albuquerque sector until 2013. The document was dated 2007. I moved to the surgical notes. October 14, 2007. Invasive pelvic reconstruction. 6 weeks of mandated bed rest. I closed my eyes and pulled up that exact month. I was a high school junior. That specific weekend, I was running the 400-meter dash at the regional track championship. I still have the silver medal in a shoebox in my closet. I was not lying in a sterile hospital bed undergoing surgical reconstruction. I was running 3 miles in the high desert sun. I looked closer at the letterhead logo. The ink sat too flat on the page. It carried a slight pixelation around the curved edges. It It was the kind of artifacting produced by a mid-tier home office inkjet printer, rather than a commercial medical press. The documents were forged. My own parents had spent hours fabricating a fake medical history. They printed it on aged paper. They drove to Denver. They put on a theatrical performance of grief and fed the forgery to my fiancé. Why? A lie this massive has an expiration date. It is unsustainable. If Julian had stayed to confront me, we could have driven to a clinic together and proved my fertility with a single blood draw. The lie was not meant to hold up to scrutiny. It was designed specifically to make him leave immediately. It was a controlled demolition. They needed Julian to pack his bags and walk away before a specific event occurred. Julian used his mother's maiden name in his daily life to avoid the weight of his father's reputation. But his father was the head of Crescent Ridge Capital, a titan in corporate asset management. If Julian and I married, his family's firm would require a mandatory prenuptial financial disclosure. It is standard protocol for families with that level of wealth. They would conduct a deep dive forensic audit of my entire background. The infertility lie was not about babies. It was about severing my connection to the Crescent Ridge auditors. The cruelty was surgical, but it was ultimately a distraction, a smoke bomb thrown into my living room, so I would choke on the fumes while the real fire burned somewhere else. They needed me single. They needed me unattached to that family. I stared at the forged papers on my dining table. Hector and Sylvia were hiding something in the dark, something so dangerous they were willing to destroy my future to keep it buried. Julian said he was at their house right now retrieving his investment portfolios. I scooped the platinum ring off the kitchen island. I grabbed the leather box containing the ultrasound. I left the fake medical records on the table and walked out the door. I was going to look my father in the eye and find out exactly what he was trying to hide. The drive south on Interstate 25 felt like a silent film playing at double speed. The Sandia Mountains loomed in the distance, cutting a jagged silhouette against the cloudless New Mexico sky. The air conditioner in my sedan struggled against the midday heat, but my palms were freezing. They gripped the steering wheel with enough force to turn my knuckles white. I was not driving toward a reconciliation. I was driving into a hostile audit. My parents lived in an exclusive gated subdivision in Albuquerque, the kind of neighborhood where the lawns stay unnaturally green despite the desert drought, and the driveways are paved with imported cobblestone. Hector built his career developing commercial real estate. He projected an image of untouchable success. His tailored suits and imported cigars were carefully curated props. Sylvia was his dedicated co-star, always hosting charity galas and pouring expensive wine for people they secretly despised. Julian, with his pedigree and his quiet trust fund, was the ultimate trophy they had secured for their collection. I parked my car on the street, avoiding the circular driveway. The heavy oak front door was unlocked. It always was during the day. I stepped into the foyer. The house smelled of lemon polish and fresh lilies. From down the hall, the low murmur of voices drifted out of my father's home office. I walked down the corridor. My flats made zero sound on the thick Persian runner. I stopped in the doorway. The home office was a shrine to Hector. Dark wood panels lined the walls. An imposing mahogany desk dominated the center of the room. Julian stood on the guest side of the desk, packing a stack of leather-bound investment portfolios into his briefcase. Hector stood behind the desk, his posture rigid. Sylvia hovered near the window, playing the role of the tragic matriarch. Julian looked up. His hands froze on the brass latches of his briefcase. "Eleanor," he said. His voice cracked, carrying a mixture of pity and exhaustion. "You should not be here." I did not answer him. I walked straight to the mahogany desk. I unclasped my purse. I pulled out the platinum engagement ring and dropped it onto the polished wood. The metal struck the surface with a sharp, solitary click. Then I reached back into my bag and pulled out the square of thermal paper. I placed the 12-week ultrasound scan directly next to the diamond. Julian stared at the tiny plotted heartbeat, his brow furrowed. The narrative he had been fed less than 24 hours ago fractured in real time. He looked at me, searching for the deception. But Hector did not look at the ultrasound. My father's eyes dropped to the edge of the desk, locking onto a thick blue folder resting just beneath Julian's left wrist. The color drained from Hector's face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. A bead of sweat materialized near his hairline. He was not afraid of the baby. He was terrified of the blue folder. Before the silence could stretch into a demand for answers, Sylvia pivoted. She executed a masterclass in toxic deflection. She glided across the Persian rug and placed a manicured hand gently on Julian's forearm. Her eyes brimmed with manufactured tears. "We did not want to break your heart, Julian," she whispered, her tone dripping with rehearsed sorrow. "She is pregnant, but the child is not yours." It was a breathtaking maneuver. When caught in a lie, build a bigger fire, shift the blame, attack the credibility of the witness. Julian turned his head. He looked at Sylvia, then he looked at me. He hesitated. That single second of hesitation was a heavy stone dropping onto fragile glass. It shattered every remaining ounce of affection I held for him. A partner who trusts you will demand proof of your betrayal. A partner who views you as a liability will search for any excuse to cut his losses. Julian did not want the truth. He wanted an exit strategy that protected his pride. I did not scream. I did not defend my fidelity. Pleading is a currency used by the guilty. I looked Julian dead in the eye, keeping my voice as flat and cold as a hospital corridor. "A DNA test takes 48 hours, I said, but financial fraud takes years to untangle." Julian blinked, the confusion deepening across his features. Financial fraud. While Hector remained paralyzed by my words, I moved. I stepped forward and snatched the blue folder out from under Julian's wrist. Hector snapped out of his trance. "Give that back," he barked. He lunged across the mahogany desk, sending a heavy crystal paperweight crashing to the floor. The glass shattered against the hardwood, sending shards scattering across the rug. I stepped backward, evading his grasping hands. The blue folder was secured firmly against my chest. Hector braced his hands on the edge of the desk, his chest heaving. The mask of the polished real estate developer dissolved, revealing a cornered, panicked animal. "Get out of my house," Sylvia hissed, her voice losing its melodic charm. "I already left," I replied. I turned my back on the three of them. I walked out of the home office, down the pristine hallway, and out the heavy oak front door. I did not run. Running implies fear. I walked with the steady, measured pace of an auditor who had just secured the primary ledger. The heat inside my sedan was stifling. I locked the doors and started the engine, letting the air conditioning blast against my face. My hands shook, a fine, uncontrollable tremor rippling through my fingers. Adrenaline flooded my system, demanding a physical release. I forced myself to take 3 deep breaths. Inhale, exhale. I placed the blue folder on the passenger seat. I flipped open the heavy cardstock cover. Inside lay a stack of financial documents printed on high-quality bond paper. The top page was a comprehensive credit report. I scan credit profiles every week for hospital compliance checks. I know how to read the codes, the trade lines, and the risk indicators. But the numbers staring back at me were impossible. I lived a quiet, modest life. My car was paid off. I rented a 2-bedroom apartment. I paid my credit card balance in full every month. This file depicted a different reality. The summary page showed a staggering debt load. 3 defaulted commercial business loans, a secondary mortgage attached to a property address in Santa Fe I had never visited, unpaid vendor invoices. The total liability equaled $450,000. My stomach churned. A wave of sharp nausea rolled through my chest. I traced the lines of data with my index finger, searching for the origin point. The accounts were not tied to my personal Social Security number. That is why they never appeared on my annual consumer credit checks. The loans were anchored to an employer identification number. An EIN functions like a Social Security number for a corporate entity. I looked at the top of the registration document. The business was registered under a specific name, Eleanor Garcia Consulting. They misspelled my first name. They dropped the A. It was a deliberate structural choice. a shadow identity designed to float through the banking system undetected by my personal financial monitors. The commercial debt was a ticking time bomb hidden in a corporate blind spot. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together, forming a terrifying picture. The infertility lie had nothing to do with saving face. If Julianne and I got married, his father's firm, Crescent Ridge Capital, would deploy their internal wealth managers to draft our prenuptial agreement. Those auditors would not just pull my personal consumer file, they would run a deep corporate sweep. They would find the EIN. They would find the defaulted commercial loans. They would discover the financial rot attached to my identity. Hector and Sylvia were not trying to ruin my happiness. They were trying to stop a forensic audit. They aborted my wedding to prevent Julian's family from uncovering a $500,000 financial crime. I sat in the sweltering car holding a piece of paper that made me legally responsible for an astronomical debt. My own flesh and blood had forged my signature, hollowed out my future, and fed my fiancé a grotesque medical lie just to keep themselves out of a federal courtroom. I closed the folder. The betrayal was no longer emotional. It was systemic. But as I stared at the misspelled name on the corporate registration, a new chilling question surfaced in my mind. Hector was a careless, arrogant man. He did not possess the meticulous accounting skills required to maintain a shadow corporation for this long. Someone else had to be balancing these books. Someone who knew exactly how to manipulate the banking system without tripping the fraud alerts. Who was secretly managing my ruin? And how much more money had they hidden in the dark? The steering wheel felt sticky beneath my palms. The heat inside the sedan baked the leather seats, releasing a faint synthetic odor. I stared at the blue folder resting on the passenger side. $450,000. The number was abstract. It was the kind of figure you read about in corporate embezzlement briefings, not something attached to a hospital employee who packs her own lunch to save $20 a week. My parents had constructed an elaborate financial trap using my name as the bait. They harvested my clean background to float their sinking real estate ventures, and when the bill came due, they prepared to burn my life to the ground to hide the smoke. I needed to call my bank. I needed to freeze my personal checking accounts before Hector could drain those too. I reached for my cell phone resting in the center console. Before my fingers could touch the screen, it vibrated. The caller identification displayed a familiar Albuquerque area code. It was the main administrative line for St. Jude Regional Medical Center, my employer. I pressed the green icon and lifted the phone to my ear. Eleanor Garcia, I answered. My voice sounded remarkably steady considering the tectonic plates of my life were actively collapsing. Eleanor, it is Marcus. Marcus was the director of human resources. He usually communicated via sterile automated emails. Hearing his voice on a direct line was an immediate red flag. He sounded strained. He cleared his throat, a dry, raspy sound that echoed through the speaker. We received a highly concerning phone call this afternoon, Eleanor. It was your father, Hector Garcia. My spine stiffened. I leaned back against the hot leather seat. What did he say, Marcus? He told us you are experiencing a severe medical crisis. He said you have been exhibiting paranoid behavior for weeks, hallucinating a pregnancy. He stated you broke into his private home office today and stole highly sensitive legal documents belonging to his clients. He sounded terrified for your safety, Eleanor. He asked us to intervene before you hurt yourself or compromised hospital records. The calculated precision of the strike left me breathless. Hector had not waited for me to digest the blue folder. He knew I would eventually trace the shadow EIN back to his accounts. He knew I was an auditor. So he decided to destroy my credibility before I could sound the alarm. If a person is documented as suffering a psychotic break, their accusations of financial fraud are dismissed as paranoid delusions. Marcus, I am perfectly healthy, I said. My tone remained flat. I am pregnant. I have the ultrasound. My father is attempting to manipulate my employment status due to a personal legal dispute. I want to believe you, Eleanor, Marcus replied, but your father forwarded a medical file. It details a history of severe pelvic trauma. It states you cannot conceive. The forged medical documents. Sylvia had not just planted them in my guest room to terrorize me. She had kept copies. They weaponized the fake surgical records to validate their narrative. A woman claiming to be pregnant when her medical history proves it is biologically impossible looks exactly like a woman losing her grip on reality. Given the sensitive nature of your position as a compliance auditor, we have to follow protocol, Marcus continued. You have access to thousands of confidential patient billing records. Until you can provide an independent psychological evaluation clearing you for duty, your security clearance is suspended, effective immediately. You are on unpaid administrative leave. Do not attempt to log into the hospital servers. A sharp, cold click echoed through the speaker as Marcus disconnected the call. I lowered the phone. The screen faded to black. In a single afternoon, I had been systematically erased. My fiancé was gone, my credit was obliterated, and now my paycheck and my professional reputation were frozen. I sat in the parking lot of a strip mall, staring at the cracked asphalt. A hospital auditor, stripped of her credentials, is just a woman yelling into a void. I had zero access to the investigative software I needed to track the corporate debt. I had zero income to hire a forensic accountant. Hector and Sylvia had successfully isolated me. They cut my supply lines. They expected me to panic. They expected me to retreat to my apartment and cry until the eviction notices arrived. I pressed my fingertips against my temples. The pressure built behind my eyes, a dull, throbbing ache. I looked back at the blue folder, the misspelled corporate registration, Eleanor Garcia Consulting. Hector was an arrogant man. He signed deals on golf courses and bullied contractors into cutting corners. He did not possess the meticulous patience required to maintain a shadow corporation. He did not know how to layer fake invoices or cycle loan payments to keep the debt hidden from routine sweeps. Someone else was balancing these books. Someone with a deep understanding of corporate accounting and a direct link to my father's historical financial records. My mind drifted back to a rainy Tuesday afternoon 10 years ago. I was 21, visiting my parents' house for the holidays. I was sitting at the kitchen island drinking coffee. The front door had opened, and my Aunt Teresa had walked in, dripping wet, without knocking. Teresa was Sylvia's younger sister. She had worked as Hector's private bookkeeper for a decade, managing his properties and filing his quarterly taxes. The family narrative was that Teresa was unstable, a paranoid hoarder who mismanaged her own money and went bankrupt. Sylvia always spoke about her with a cloying pity, warning me never to lend Teresa cash. But on that rainy Tuesday, Teresa had not looked unstable. She had looked furious. She marched into the kitchen, slammed a stack of spiral-bound ledgers onto the granite counter, and pointed a shaking finger at Hector. "You moved the escrow funds," Teresa had screamed. "You signed my name on the municipal permits, and you moved the funds." Sylvia had calmly picked up the landline phone and dialed the local precinct. She told the dispatcher her sister was having a manic episode and threatening violence. When the police arrived, Teresa was sobbing on the front porch, repeating the same accusations, while Hector handed the officers a cup of coffee and shook his head in mock sorrow. The family banished Teresa after that day. She was erased from the holiday photos and excluded from the group chats. I opened my eyes. The throbbing ache in my temples sharpened into a laser focus. Teresa was not a paranoid hoarder. She was the prototype. She was the first woman Hector and Sylvia had hollowed out to save themselves. If she was the bookkeeper when the initial embezzlement occurred, she knew exactly where Hector buried his bodies. She knew his account structures. She knew his passwords. I grabbed my keys and turned the ignition. I did not need a hospital server. I needed the woman who built the maze. Teresa lived in a dilapidated duplex on the edge of the Albuquerque city limits. I had not spoken to her in 5 years. I did not know if she would even open her door for the daughter of the people who destroyed her life. But she was the only piece on the board Hector could not control. I shifted the car into drive. The tires gripped the hot asphalt as I pulled out of the parking lot. I had zero resources and a frozen paycheck, but I had a blue folder and a ghost from my father's past. As I merged onto the highway, my phone vibrated again. A text message notification flashed across the screen. It was an alert from my personal banking application. Your login credentials for the primary checking account ending in 4829 have been successfully updated. My foot slammed the brake pedal. The car jerked, throwing me against the seatbelt. I snatched the phone and stared at the glowing text. I had not updated my passwords. The primary checking account held my emergency savings, $7,000 I had scraped together over 3 years. Hector was not finished. Suspending my job was just the opening salvo. He was actively draining my cash reserves right now. If I did not stop the transfer in the next 10 minutes, I would not even have enough money to buy gas to reach Teresa's house. The digital alert glared from my phone screen. Your login credentials have been successfully updated. I pulled the sedan hard onto the gravel shoulder of the highway, throwing the gear shift into park. Dust plumed around the windows. I opened the banking application. Access denied. I typed my password again. Incorrect credential. My fingers moved in a frantic blur, tapping the sequence for emergency account recovery. The system prompted a security question. What is your mother's maiden name? I typed it. The screen refreshed, displaying a secondary verification step. A 6-digit code had been sent to the recovery email address on file. The recovery email displayed was not mine. It was a generic alphanumeric string ending in a commercial domain. Hector had routed the recovery keys to his own shadow servers. I dialed the fraud prevention hotline for the bank. An automated voice informed me the current wait time for a representative was 45 minutes. I hung up. 45 minutes was enough time to wire $7,000 through 3 different offshore endpoints, leaving 0 traceable residue. My emergency savings were gone. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel. The vinyl was hot and sticky. They had taken my fiancé, my credit, my job, and now my liquid cash. The isolation tactic was complete. I was a pregnant woman sitting in a sweltering car with a quarter tank of gas and an empty wallet. I lifted my head. The panic did not return. The panic had burned off, leaving a cold, dense clarity. An auditor does not weep over a drained account. An auditor traces the flow. I merged back onto the highway, heading toward the city limits. The landscape shifted from manicured subdivisions to sun-bleached strip malls and cracked pavement. Teresa lived in a neighborhood the city planners had abandoned decades ago. Chain-link fences bordered overgrown yards. The duplex sat at the end of a dead-end street, its stucco exterior peeling in jagged strips. I parked the sedan behind a rusted pickup truck. I grabbed the blue folder and walked up the cracked concrete path. The front windows were covered with heavy blackout curtains. A faded wind chime hung from the porch awning, clinking faintly in the dry desert breeze. I knocked twice. The hollow sound echoed against the solid wood. I waited. Nothing moved inside. I knocked again, louder this time. A deadbolt engaged with a heavy metallic slide. The door opened 3 inches, restricted by a thick brass chain. A sliver of a face appeared in the gap. Teresa looked older than her 58 years. Her dark hair was streaked with stark silver lines. She wore a faded, oversized cardigan despite the suffocating heat. Her eyes darted from my face to the blue folder clutched against my chest. "Eleanor," she said. Her voice was raspy like dry leaves scraping across a driveway. "Go home. If your mother finds out you are here, she will call the police again." "I am not here for Sylvia," I said. I held up the blue folder, wedging the edge into the gap between the door and the frame. "I need an accountant, Teresa." She stared at the corporate seal visible on the top page. Her eyes narrowed. The suspicion gave way to a slow, terrifying recognition. She did not ask me to explain. She reached forward, disengaged the brass chain, and pulled the door open. The interior of the duplex was suffocating. Stacks of cardboard boxes lined the walls, forming a narrow labyrinth through the living room. Piles of newspapers and old mail covered the coffee table. The air smelled of stale coffee and old paper. The family called her a paranoid hoarder. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim lighting, I realized the boxes were not filled with trash. They were filled with perfectly categorized financial documents, labeled with dates spanning 2 decades. This was not a hoard. It was an archive. Teresa cleared a space at a small Formica dining table. I sat down and opened the blue folder, spreading the forged loan applications across the surface. She pulled a pair of reading glasses from her pocket and leaned over the paperwork. I watched her eyes scan the shadow employer identification number. I expected her to gasp. I expected a reaction of profound shock at the $450,000 of hidden commercial debt. Teresa did not gasp. She sighed. Her shoulders slumped, deflating beneath the oversized cardigan. She reached out and traced the misspelled corporate registration with a trembling index finger. Eleanor Garcia Consulting. "They did it to me first," she whispered. The sound was fragile, hollowed out by 10 years of forced silence. She stood up and navigated the maze of boxes, returning with a heavy metal lockbox. She dropped it onto the table. A small brass key hung from a chain around her neck. She unlocked the box and pulled out a stack of spiral-bound ledgers dating back to 2015, the year I started college, the year the family banished her. Teresa laid the original ledgers next to my forged loan applications. "I was Hector's bookkeeper for a decade," she explained, her voice gaining a steady rhythm. "He used my name as a guarantor on a municipal construction permit. When the project went bankrupt, he forged a transfer document, draining the escrow accounts to cover his personal liabilities. The state auditors came after me. I tried to show them the real ledgers. I tried to show Sylvia." Teresa looked up, meeting my gaze. Her eyes were hard, reflecting a decade of unacknowledged grief. "Your mother did not defend me, Eleanor. She orchestrated my ruin. She told the auditors I was suffering a psychotic breakdown. She told the family I was a paranoid thief. She burned my life to the ground to keep her husband out of a federal courtroom." A cold shiver crawled up my spine. The exact same playbook. They had isolated her, discredited her mental health, and saddled her with the financial ruin. Now they were running the identical sequence on me. We leaned over the table, cross-referencing the documents. Teresa knew Hector's operational cadence. She identified the routing structures he favored. The shadow EIN attached to my name was routing the commercial loan payouts through a series of shell accounts. "Look here," Teresa pointed to a sequence of routing numbers on the bottom of a forged Crescent Ridge Capital loan application. "This is a blind sweep. The funds hit the corporate account under your misspelled name, then immediately transfer to an external holding account before the bank issues a monthly statement. The holding account number is redacted. If we cannot identify the external holding account, we cannot prove Hector received the stolen funds," I said. "The trail ends at my fake corporation. I am holding the bag for $500,000. We need the transfer receipts," Teresa said. "Hector is paranoid. He would never digitize the final transfer confirmations. He prints them. He keeps hard copies until the audit window closes." My mind snapped back to the mahogany desk. I saw Julianne packing his briefcase. I saw Hector lunging across the polished wood. But the edges of the memory sharpened, focusing on a detail I had ignored in the chaos. Tucked into the corner of the home office, sitting flush against the dark wood paneling, was a commercial-grade cross-cut shredder. It was an expensive machine designed to obliterate sensitive documents into unreadable confetti. During holiday dinners, I used to hear Hector cursing at that machine. He constantly complained that the blades jammed when he fed it thick thermal paper. Thermal paper, the kind banks use for physical transfer receipts. If Hector was terrified enough by the blue folder to drain my bank account, he was terrified enough to destroy the remaining evidence. "He is shredding them right now," I said. I stood up, pushing the chair back so hard it scraped against the linoleum. "The crosscut machine in his office. He is destroying the hard copies." Teresa grabbed my wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "You cannot go back there, Eleanor. If you step foot on that property, Sylvia will call the police. She will enforce the narrative that you are having a manic episode. They will place you on a mandatory psychiatric hold." I pulled my wrist free. I picked up the blue folder and tucked it under my arm. "I am not going to knock on the front door, Teresa. I am going to bypass the security panel." "You do not have the master code," she warned. "Hector changes it every month." I looked at the woman who had spent 10 years preserving the truth in cardboard boxes. Hector changes the user pins, I replied, but he is a creature of habit. He never resets the factory override sequence because he is terrified of locking himself out. You installed that security system in 2012. You know the sequence. Teresa stared at me. The silence stretched tight, pulling the tension across the dim room. She reached into her cardigan pocket, pulled out a stub of a pencil, and wrote a 6-digit numeric code on the back of a grocery receipt. She slid the paper across the Formica table. If they catch you inside that house, Eleanor, they will not just ruin your credit. They will take your freedom. I folded the receipt and placed it in my pocket. I already lost my freedom the day they stole my name. Now I am going to steal it back. I walked out of the duplex into the blinding afternoon sun. The air was thick, pressing against my skin. I had a numeric code, a blue folder, and a rapidly closing window of opportunity. I had to infiltrate a fortified house, retrieve shredded thermal paper from a jammed machine, and escape without tripping a silent alarm. As I opened my car door, a new notification lit up my phone screen. A calendar alert. Reminder, Crescent Ridge Capital Annual Portfolio Review. Julian, tomorrow at 9 in the morning. The blood froze in my veins. Julian was not just canceling a wedding. He was presenting his updated financial disclosures to his father's corporate board tomorrow morning. If those auditors reviewed his recent personal associations, they would flag my shadow EIN immediately. Hector was not just shredding paper to hide the money. He was shredding paper because Julian's family was preparing to initiate a federal inquiry in less than 18 hours. The calendar alert for Crescent Ridge Capital blared through my car speakers. I dismissed the notification and gripped the steering wheel. 18 hours until Julian presented his financial disclosures to his father's corporate board. I could not break into my parents' house empty-handed. If I wanted to pull the digital routing logs from Hector's desktop computer, I needed the encrypted USB drive sitting in my apartment desk drawer. The compliance software on that drive was the only tool capable of bypassing a standard firewall without leaving a traceable footprint. I navigated the afternoon traffic heading toward my complex. The sky above Santa Fe had turned a bruised purple, signaling a late summer monsoon. The air pressure dropped, making the inside of the sedan feel like a vacuum. I pulled into the resident parking lot, and my foot pressed hard against the brake pedal. A charcoal gray luxury sedan occupied my assigned space. Julian. He stood leaning against the stucco wall outside my front door. He wore a tailored navy suit, the jacket unbuttoned despite the stifling humidity. He did not hold a bouquet of apologies. He did not carry the platinum engagement ring. He held a thick, transparent plastic document sleeve. His posture was rigid, his jaw locked in a tight grimace. The man who had spent 6 months hunting for the perfect vintage diamond now looked at me like I was a hazardous waste spill. I turned off the engine. I grabbed the blue folder, tucking it deep into my oversized leather tote bag. I walked up the concrete stairs, my flats clicking against the pavement. Julian did not step forward to greet me. He did not ask how I was feeling. He just watched my approach with cold, dead eyes. "Unlock the door," he said. I stopped on the top step, maintaining a physical distance between us. "You made your position very clear on the phone, Julian. You left the ring on the counter. We have nothing left to discuss. This is not a social visit, Eleanor." He stepped away from the wall. He lifted the plastic sleeve. "I need you to explain these before I hand them over to federal authorities." A fresh spike of adrenaline pierced my chest. I unlocked the deadbolt, pushing the front door open. The apartment was still dark, the air conditioning running its relentless drone. I did not invite him to sit down. I dropped my tote bag on the entryway table and turned to face him. Julian pulled a stack of printed pages from the plastic sleeve. He slapped them onto the kitchen island right next to the spot where his house keys still rested. "Read them," he commanded. I picked up the top page. It was an email printout. The sender address was my personal Gmail account. The recipient was a regional manager at a commercial bank in downtown Albuquerque. The subject line read, "Urgent Transfer Authorization. Eleanor Garcia, Consulting." I scanned the body of the text. The writing mimicked my professional cadence perfectly. It used the exact phrasing I employed during hospital audits. Please expedite the clearing of the attached municipal bonds. Route the funds to the secondary holding account by end of business today. Ensure the primary ledger reflects a zero balance. Thank you, Eleanor. I flipped to the second page. Another email from my account. This one authorized a wire withdrawal of $85,000. The third page authorized another $50,000. Every single message painted a vivid, undeniable picture of a woman directing a sophisticated corporate embezzlement ring. My lungs tightened. Hector had not just hidden his debt behind a shadow employer identification number. He had actively laid a digital breadcrumb trail pointing a giant neon arrow directly at my head. He had hijacked my personal email, forging correspondences to bank managers. He framed me as the criminal mastermind. I dropped the papers onto the court's counter. These are forged, Julian. My father spoofed my email address. I never sent these messages. I did not even know this consulting firm existed until this afternoon. Julian let out a dry, bitter laugh. It echoed in the empty kitchen, a harsh, metallic sound. Your father warned me you would say that, he replied. Hector sat me down in his office right after you stormed out. He cried, Eleanor. A grown man wept because he found out his own daughter was robbing her future-in-laws. The words struck me with physical force. I gripped the edge of the island. Future-in-laws. I looked back down at the forged emails. I checked the source accounts listed in the transfer requests. They were not random commercial banks. They were unsecured lines of credit. And the originating institution listed in the fine print was Crescent Ridge Capital. The scope of the betrayal crystallized. Hector had not just stolen money, he had stolen it directly from Julian's family firm. He funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars out of Crescent Ridge over the last 3 years, using my name as the shield. He stole from your father, I whispered, staring at the printouts. You stole from my father, Julian corrected, his voice rising in volume. You used your access to my life to bypass our internal security checks. You set up a ghost corporation. You took $300,000, Eleanor. The infertility lie makes perfect sense now. You wanted to rush the wedding before our annual corporate audit caught the missing funds. The psychological warfare was staggering. Hector had flipped the entire narrative upside down. He convinced Julian that the fake medical file was my idea. He made Julian believe I was a barren sociopath rushing to the altar to cover up a 6-figure theft. Julian leaned across the kitchen island, pressing his palms flat against the stone. My father is taking these printed emails to the Federal Bureau of Investigation in 48 hours. The room started to spin. 48 hours. I am giving you one chance, Julian said, his eyes stripping me of every ounce of humanity. Tell me where the $300,000 is hidden. Return the money to Crescent Ridge. If you cooperate, I will ask my father to handle this civilly. If you lie to me again, you are going to federal prison. He did not wait for my response. He turned around and walked out the front door, pulling it shut behind him. The heavy thud vibrated through the floorboards. I stood alone in the dim kitchen. The stakes had just escalated from personal financial ruin to imminent federal incarceration. If I could not prove Hector forged those emails and stole that money, I would be indicted. I pictured the cold concrete walls of a holding cell. I placed a trembling hand over my stomach. I would give birth to my child in federal custody while Hector and Sylvia drank mimosas at the country club. I had exactly 2 days to dismantle a 5-year conspiracy. I needed the IP addresses of those spoofed emails. Digital forensics would prove the messages originated from Hector's home network, not my apartment. I also needed the shredded thermal paper jammed in his office machine. Those receipts would prove the stolen Crescent Ridge funds landed in Hector's personal offshore accounts, not mine. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the grocery receipt Teresa had given me. The faded pencil marks displayed the 6-digit numeric factory override code for the alarm system she installed in 2012. It was my only key into the fortress. But as I stared at the numbers, a memory surfaced. Before Julian walked out the door, he had made a passing comment. He mentioned Hector had hired a private security crew this morning. Hector was terrified after I grabbed the blue folder off his desk. Julian said the technicians were installing biometric deadbolts and upgrading the alarm panels on all the exterior doors. Teresa's factory override code was useless. The old system was gone. The sky outside my window cracked with a sudden crack of thunder. The monsoon broke, sending sheets of heavy rain lashing against the glass. I was locked out. I had a ticking federal deadline, a forged paper trail pointing a loaded gun at my chest, and an impenetrable fortress standing between me and the truth. How could I bypass my parents' newly installed security system? A soft chime broke the silence of my dark kitchen. The screen of my laptop illuminated, casting a pale blue glow across the quartz island. An email notification hovered in the corner of the display. The sender was Sylvia Garcia. I leaned forward and clicked the icon. The recipient list read like a strategic deployment. My aunts, my uncles, Julian's parents, 3 members of the Crescent Ridge Capital Executive Board. The subject line was typed in careful title case, Healing and Grace for Eleanor. I read the body of the message. The text was a masterstroke of psychological manipulation. Sylvia wrote that the family was enduring a profound private tragedy. She claimed my mental health had deteriorated rapidly, causing severe delusions and reckless financial behavior. She stated that Hector and I needed a safe, contained environment to begin the healing process. She formally invited everyone to a private brunch at the Santa Fe Country Club on Sunday morning to offer prayers and support for my recovery. I stared at the glowing screen. Sylvia was weaponizing her vanity. She was using the most exclusive dining room in the city to control the narrative. By inviting the Crescent Ridge executives, she was preemptively clearing Hector's name. She wanted to stand in front of Julian's father and play the weeping mother. She wanted to establish a public record of my supposed insanity before Julian handed those forged emails to the federal authorities on Monday. I printed the invitation. I set the paper down next to the forged bank transfers Julian had left behind. Sylvia intended to use Sunday morning as a theater production, but she had also handed me a precise operational window. Hector and Sylvia would be 3 miles away pressing linen napkins to their eyes. The house in Albuquerque would be empty. I picked up my phone and dialed Teresa's number. She answered on the second ring. "They are hosting a brunch on Sunday," I said. "The house will be clear from 9 until noon. But Julian told me Hector hired a security firm yesterday. He said they installed biometric deadbolts and upgraded the alarm panels. Your old master code might be useless." Teresa let out a dry, rasping laugh. "Hector is a man who buys a custom suit and wears cheap polyester socks," she replied. "He cares about optics. He probably paid top dollar to secure the front entrance and the patio doors because that is what the neighbors see. But the side garage entrance runs on a separate analog circuit. I wired it myself 10 years ago. If you use the physical keypad hidden behind the recycling bins, my factory override sequence will bypass the localized grid." A tight knot in my chest uncoiled. I spent the rest of Saturday night preparing my audit tools. I loaded my secure USB drive with the hospital-grade compliance software. I packed a pair of steel tweezers, a set of latex gloves, and a heavy-duty flashlight. Sunday morning broke with a harsh, glaring sun. The storm had passed, leaving the desert air thick with evaporating moisture. I parked my sedan 2 streets away from my parents' gated subdivision. I sat behind the steering wheel, watching the digital clock on my dashboard click to 9:15. A sleek, silver Mercedes glided past my intersection, turning onto the main boulevard. Hector was driving. Sylvia sat in the passenger seat, wearing a wide-brimmed hat. The diversion was active. I exited my car and walked down the manicured sidewalk. The neighborhood was quiet. Sprinkler systems hissed in the distance, throwing arcs of water over pristine emerald lawns. I slipped down the narrow side corridor of my parents' property. The shadow of the tall stucco wall hid me from the street. I found the side garage entrance exactly where Teresa described. A row of heavy plastic recycling bins shielded the door. I pulled them aside. A faded plastic keypad rested flush against the wall. The numbers were worn down from years of use. I pulled the grocery receipt from my pocket. I typed the 6 digits Teresa had written down. A sharp beep sounded from the panel. The red indicator light shifted to solid green. The deadbolt retracted with a heavy metallic slide. I pushed the door open and stepped into the dim garage. The scent of motor oil and expensive car wax hung in the stagnant air. I walked through the interior access door and entered the main hallway. The house was silent. The air conditioning whispered through the ceiling vents. I moved directly to Hector's home office. I pushed the heavy oak door open. The room smelled of stale cigar smoke and old sweat. It was the scent of a man failing to outrun his own lies. The mahogany desk was clear. The broken crystal paperweight had been swept up. I walked around the desk and knelt beside the commercial cross-cut shredder tucked into the corner. The power indicator was dark. Hector had unplugged the machine. I grabbed the heavy plastic housing and pulled the top section upward. It resisted. The internal blades were jammed tight, packed with thick, waxy paper. I braced my knee against the base and pulled harder. The housing popped off with a loud snap. I turned on my flashlight, holding it between my teeth. I reached into my bag and pulled out the steel tweezers. The shredding gears were choked with strips of white thermal paper. Bank receipts. I wedged the tip of the tweezers into the metal teeth. I pinched a cluster of shredded strips and pulled carefully. The paper slid out, curling into tight spirals. I dropped them into a clear plastic evidence bag. I repeated the process. My hands moved with steady, mechanical precision. A sharp edge of the metal gear scraped my index finger, drawing a thin bead of blood. I ignored the sting. I extracted every single strip of thermal paper, clearing the jam. I sealed the plastic bag. The physical proof of Hector's offshore deposits was secured. I stood up and sat in Hector's leather desk chair. I pressed the power button on his desktop computer. The monitor glowed, illuminating the dark wood paneling. A password prompt appeared on the screen. I did not bother trying to guess his current login phrase. I inserted my secure USB drive into the side port. I initiated a hard reboot. As the system powered down, I pressed the override keys, forcing the computer to boot directly from my external drive. The screen went black before a cascade of green text scrolled down the display. The hospital compliance software bypassed the local operating system entirely. I opened the network diagnostic tool. I pulled the printed forged emails Julian had left at my apartment out of my bag. I typed the specific routing headers and timestamp data from the spoofed messages into the search field. I hit execute. A progress bar appeared on the screen. The software sent a reverse ping, querying the digital pathway the emails had traveled. If Hector was a professional hacker, he would have routed his traffic through a virtual private network, bouncing the signal across multiple international servers. But Hector was a real estate developer playing out of his depth. The progress bar filled. The screen flashed a match. The origin IP address populated the terminal window. I looked at the string of numbers. I minimized the window and opened the local network settings for the router sitting on the edge of the mahogany desk. I compared the digits. They were identical. The emails authorizing the theft of $300,000 did not originate from my apartment. They were drafted, sent, and verified from this exact room. The digital fingerprints were painted all over Hector's hardware. I initiated a bulk download, pulling the router logs, the keystroke history, and the internal cache directly onto my USB drive. The data transferred in silent, rapid bursts. I ejected the drive and slipped it into my pocket. I looked at the clock on the wall. 10:45. The brunch was currently in full swing. Sylvia was likely standing at the head of a linen-draped table, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, feeding lies to Julian's father. They thought they had neutralized the threat. They thought I was sitting in my dark apartment, paralyzed by a frozen bank account and a suspended security clearance. I picked up the evidence bag full of shredded receipts. I walked out of the office, ensuring the door clicked shut behind me. I exited through the side garage door, locking the deadbolt and sliding the recycling bins back into place. I returned to my sedan and placed the evidence on the passenger seat. I gripped the steering wheel. I had the digital traces. I had the physical paper. I had the ledger codes. I started the engine and turned the car toward the Santa Fe Country Club. Sylvia wanted an audience. She wanted a stage. She had gathered every key player in this financial fraud into one single room. I was going to give her exactly the performance she asked for. But as I pulled up to the ornate wrought iron gates of the country club, my stomach dropped. Parked discreetly near the service entrance, idling in the shadows of a large oak tree, was an unmarked white transport van. 2 men wearing clinical scrubs stood leaning against the side panel, smoking cigarettes. It was a private psychiatric transport team. The trap was not just social humiliation. Hector had arranged for an involuntary medical extraction. What else was waiting for me inside that dining room? The realization hit with the blunt force of a physical blow. The healing brunch was a staging ground. Hector and Sylvia did not just want to paint me as unstable to Julian's family. They needed me incapacitated. In the state of New Mexico, an involuntary 72-hour psychiatric hold can be initiated if an individual poses a direct threat to themselves or others. They had hired a private medical transport team to stand by. The objective was clear. They intended to provoke me in front of 30 witnesses, force an emotional outburst, and use that reaction as the legal justification to drag me out of the country club in restraints. If they succeeded, I would be locked in a clinical holding cell while Julian handed my forged emails to the Federal Bureau of Investigation on Monday morning. By the time I cleared the psychiatric hold, the arrest warrant for wire fraud would already be signed. I sat in the driver's seat of my sedan, the engine idling. My hands rested on the steering wheel, slick with nervous sweat. The white transport van sat 70 yards away, idling near the service entrance. Teresa sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window. She had insisted on coming with me. She wore a tailored black dress that looked 10 years out of date, but fit her with a sharp, austere dignity. She noticed the direction of my gaze. Medical transport, she noted, her voice flat. Sylvia used the same tactic during my audit hearing. She brought an EMT unit to the courthouse. She told the judge I was actively suicidal. It discredited every single ledger I presented. I looked at Teresa. The parallels were terrifying. Hector and Sylvia were running the exact same play, but the stakes were magnified. We are not going to give them an outburst, Teresa. We are going to give them an audit. I reached into the back seat and grabbed the 3 manila folders I had compiled late last night. The physical weight of the paper felt grounding. I spent 6 hours at Teresa's wobbly kitchen table reconstructing the shredded thermal receipts. It was meticulous, agonizing work piecing together the fragmented bank codes and matching them to the offshore routing numbers detailed in Teresa's 2015 ledgers. The reconstructed receipts were now laminated onto clear plastic backing, sitting inside these folders, alongside the IP address logs I extracted from Hector's router. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. I wore my sharpest charcoal blazer. My hair was pulled back into a severe knot. I did not look like a grieving fiancé or a hysterical daughter. I looked like a compliance officer preparing to deliver a hostile termination notice. We exited the vehicle. The dry heat of a high desert pressed against my skin. I walked toward the grand entrance of the Santa Fe Country Club, Teresa matching my stride. The lobby was a cavern of polished marble and dark mahogany. A brass placard displayed the directory. The Garcia private reception was located in the sunroom at the end of the western corridor. We walked down the long hallway. The thick carpet absorbed the sound of our footsteps. As we approached the heavy oak double doors, the low murmur of polite conversation drifted out, the clinking of crystal glasses, the soft scrape of silver cutlery against porcelain. I paused, placing a hand flat against the heavy wood of the door. The pressure cooker was screaming inside my chest. If my voice cracked, if my hands trembled, if I showed a single ounce of genuine emotional pain, Hector would signal those men outside, and this entire counteroffensive would collapse into a psychiatric nightmare. I had to execute this flawlessly. I could not raise my volume a single decibel. I pushed the doors open. The sunroom was bathed in brilliant mid-morning light, streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. 3 linen-draped tables were arranged in a semicircle. My extended family occupied the outer tables. Aunts, uncles, and cousins who had ignored my existence for years now sat sipping mimosas, whispering in hushed, performative tones. At the head table sat the core targets. Hector wore a tailored gray suit projecting an aura of stoic paternal strength. Sylvia sat beside him wearing a pristine white dress, dabbing her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. Julian sat frozen, staring at his untouched plate. Next to Julian sat his parents. His father, Richard, was the chief executive of Crescent Ridge Capital. Richard possessed the cold, calculating gaze of a man who evaluated human beings purely by their net worth. The chief financial officer of Crescent Ridge sat next to Richard, sipping black coffee. My sudden appearance acted like a vacuum, sucking the air out of the room. The polite murmurs ceased. The clinking of cutlery stopped. 30 pairs of eyes snapped toward the doorway. I stepped into the room. Teresa followed, stopping a few feet behind my right shoulder. Sylvia's head jerked up. The monogrammed handkerchief dropped to the tablecloth. Her eyes widened, a flash of genuine panic cracking her tragic mask. She had not anticipated me bringing a witness, especially not the witness she had spent a decade convincing the family was a paranoid lunatic. Hector recovered faster. He stood up, pushing his chair back. The scrape of the wooden legs against the floorboards was the only sound in the silent room. "Eleanor," he said, his voice laced with heavy theatrical sorrow. "We did not think you would come. We are here to support you, honey. Please sit down." He took a step toward me, holding his hands out in a placating gesture. It was a calculated movement designed to appear comforting while subtly boxing me into a corner. "Teresa is not on the guest list," Hector added, his tone hardening slightly as his eyes flicked toward my aunt. "She should not be here. This is a delicate environment." I did not move. I did not acknowledge his outstretched hands. I kept my posture rigid, my expression neutral. "Teresa is my +1, Hector," I replied. My voice carried the flat, clipped cadence I reserved for non-compliant hospital administrators. Sylvia stood up her chair, screeching against the floor. She stepped in front of Julianne, positioning herself as a physical barrier. "Eleanor," she pleaded, her voice trembling with practiced fragility, "we are trying to help you. You are severely unwell. You need to let us get you the psychiatric help you desperately require. The delusions are tearing this family apart." She was priming the audience, setting the stage for the men in the white van waiting outside. I did not take the bait. I did not raise my voice to argue my sanity. I bypassed the emotional theater entirely. "I am not here to discuss my health, Sylvia," I stated, ensuring my volume remained conversational. "I am here to discuss the $300,000 you and Hector embezzled from Crescent Ridge Capital using a forged corporate entity registered under my name." The silence that followed was absolute. A collective gasp rippled across the outer tables. My Aunt Clara dropped her mimosa, the glass shattering against the saucer. Richard Julian's father leaned forward. His eyes narrowing into sharp, dark slits. He stopped looking at me with the detached pity reserved for a mentally ill daughter-in-law. He looked at me like a shareholder who had just been informed of a massive corporate liability. "What did you just say?" Richard demanded. His voice possessed the deep, rumbling authority of a boardroom predator. Hector flushed a deep crimson red. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "Do not listen to her, Richard. She is having a psychotic break. She stole the money, and now she is trying to shift the blame because the audit caught her." Hector signaled frantically to a waiter standing near the service doors, a subtle hand gesture designed to summon the medical transport team. The clock was ticking. I walked straight to the head table. I placed the first manila folder directly in the center of the linen cloth, resting it beside a silver basket of untouched croissants. The physical presence of the folder shifted the gravity of the room. A psychiatric transport team cannot arrest paper. I looked Richard dead in the eye. "Let us review the exhibits." The room remained suspended in a fragile glass tension. I kept my hand flat on the cover of the manila folder. Richard leaned forward. The head of Crescent Ridge Capital did not build a financial empire by coddling emotional outbursts. He built it by reading the fine print. He possessed the predatory stillness of a man who evaluated every interaction as a potential liability. He ignored Hector's frantic signaling to the waitstaff. He ignored Sylvia's trembling hands. His dark eyes dropped to the folder resting on the white linen tablecloth. "Open it," Richard commanded. His voice carried no warmth. Hector stepped around the table, his expensive leather shoes scraping against the hardwood floor. "Richard, you cannot entertain this delusion," Hector pleaded. He reached for the folder, attempting to slide it away from the center of the table. "She needs a hospital. She is trying to ruin Julian because he called off the wedding." Richard did not look at my father. He reached out and placed his palm firmly over Hector's hand, pinning it to the table. "Let her speak," Richard said. Hector swallowed hard. He slowly pulled his hand back, retreating to his chair. I flipped the folder open. The sharp rustle of thick cardstock sliced through the quiet dining room. I bypassed the emotional theater and leaned into the sterile mechanics of my profession. "Exhibit A," I announced. I slid the first document across the linen directly in front of Richard and his chief financial officer. "This is the state registration for a corporate entity named Eleanor Garcia Consulting." I tapped the misspelled first name with my index finger. "Please note the spelling discrepancy. More importantly, note the date of incorporation, August 14th, 2009. I was an 18-year-old college freshman living in a dormitory on that date. I did not possess the capital or the legal framework to establish a commercial consulting firm." Julian stared at the registration date. His brow nodded. He looked at me, then looked at Hector. "Attached to that corporate charter is a shadow employer identification number," I continued. "It functions as a corporate social security code. That specific number is currently anchoring $450,000 of defaulted commercial debt. Debt accrued through unsecured lines of credit." Richard adjusted his posture. The chief financial officer pulled a silver pen from his breast pocket and began tracing the lines of data on the page. Sylvia slammed her hands onto the table. The silverware rattled. "She forged it," Sylvia cried, her voice shrill, echoing off the high ceilings. "She set it up to steal from you, Julian. She is a criminal pretending to be a victim." Sylvia's strategy was predictable: deny and project. She was relying on the forged emails Julian had shown me yesterday, the digital breadcrumbs Hector had planted to frame me. I turned the page in the folder. "Exhibit B," I said. I slid a stack of network diagnostic logs toward the Crescent Ridge executives. Yesterday, Julian visited my apartment. He presented several printed emails supposedly sent from my personal account authorizing the withdrawal of funds from your firm. Julian stiffened his tailored navy suit, suddenly looking too large for his frame. "You told me those emails were fake," he muttered. "They are forged, Julian," I replied, maintaining my level tone. "But simply calling them fake is an emotional defense. I am an auditor. I rely on data. Last night, I extracted the digital routing headers from the physical printouts you provided. I used a hospital-grade compliance software to run a reverse trace on the origin server." I pointed to the highlighted string of numbers on the diagnostic log. "Those emails did not originate from my apartment network," I stated. "The IP address listed on that report belongs to the local area network router sitting in Hector's home office. The messages framing me for corporate embezzlement were drafted, sent, and deleted from a desktop computer located in the exact same room where he keeps his financial ledgers." The color drained from Julian's face. He looked at the IP address, then slowly turned his head to look at Hector. The narrative he had swallowed, the tragic story of an infertile, manipulative fiancé, was fracturing into 1,000 jagged pieces. Hector began to sweat. A visible sheen coated his forehead. "Richard," he stammered, his voice losing its polished resonance. "She hacked my network. She is a compliance officer. She knows how to manipulate digital footprints. She planted that IP address to frame me." Hector was grasping at straws, throwing technical terms he barely understood into the air, hoping one would stick. Richard ignored him. He tapped the edge of the table with his index finger. Digital spoofing is plausible, Richard said, his voice a low rumble. An IP address trace is circumstantial, without financial verification. Where did the capital go, Eleanor? If you did not take the $300,000 from my firm, who received the payout? I stepped back, allowing Teresa to move forward. She stood beside me, her posture straight, her chin raised. For a decade, she had carried the weight of the family's shame. She had been erased. Now she stood in the center of the Santa Fe Country Club, holding the final piece of the puzzle. Teresa placed a second folder onto the table. Exhibit C, she said. Her voice was raspy, but it carried an undeniable strength. I opened the second folder. Inside, resting on sheets of clear laminate, were dozens of jagged, white thermal paper strips. They had been painstakingly taped together, reconstructing 3 distinct banking receipts. My father is a careless man, I explained. He attempted to destroy the physical evidence of his offshore transfers yesterday afternoon. He fed the receipts into a cross-cut shredder. He jammed the machine. We extracted the debris and rebuilt the documents. The chief financial officer leaned close to the laminated pages. His eyes darted across the reconstructed numbers. These receipts authorize external wire transfers, I said. They detail the movement of funds from the shadow corporation registered in my name directly into an offshore holding account. I slid a third document onto the table, a spiral-bound ledger page dated 2015. Teresa was Hector's private bookkeeper before he framed her for a similar municipal fraud 10 years ago, I stated. She retained the original financial ledgers. The offshore holding account listed on those shredded receipts matches the exact personal account Hector used to hide his assets in 2015. The dining room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The chief financial officer pulled a smartphone from his pocket. He opened a secure application and typed the routing numbers from the reconstructed thermal paper into his database. He waited 5 seconds. The executive looked up, his face carved from stone. He turned to Richard. The routing numbers match our 2018 corporate write-offs, Richard.
The funds originated from our unsecured credit division, bounced through the Garcia Consulting entity, and landed in this specific offshore account. The audit was complete. The paper trail was closed.
Julian buried his face in his hands. A quiet, ragged breath escaped his lungs. He finally understood the magnitude of the lie. He had abandoned a pregnant woman, leaving an engagement ring on a kitchen counter because he chose to believe a cornered embezzler over his own partner. Hector collapsed back into his chair. The polished real estate developer was gone, replaced by a hollow, terrified man facing the collapse of his entire existence. Sylvia stared at the table, her mouth opening and closing silently, unable to formulate another lie. I looked at Richard. You have the evidence, Richard. You have the IP logs, the corporate registration, and the transfer receipts. Before Richard could respond, the heavy oak doors of the sunroom burst open. The polite veneer of the country club shattered. 2 men wearing clinical white scrubs marched into the private dining room. They were broad-shouldered and moved with practiced mechanical efficiency. One of them carried a heavy nylon restraint belt hooked to his belt loop. The private psychiatric transport team had entered the building. Hector leaped to his feet, pointing a trembling finger directly at my chest. His eyes were wild-wide, with the desperate, frantic energy of a cornered predator playing his final card. "Take her!" Hector screamed, his voice cracking. "She is a danger to herself. Sedate her and get her out of this room right now." The 2 men stepped toward me, their expressions blank and professional, closing the distance across the Persian rug. The financial truth was sitting on the table, but physical force was walking right toward my arms. The 2 men in clinical scrubs closed the distance, crossing the thick Persian rug with heavy, deliberate strides. The nylon restraint belt clicked softly against the hip of the lead orderly. Hector stood behind his chair, chest heaving, his arm extended like a general ordering an execution. "She is experiencing a severe manic episode," Hector yelled, projecting his voice so the entire dining room could hear. "We have medical authorization. Secure her before she harms the baby." Sylvia began to weep, a high-pitched theatrical wail covering her face with her hands. "Oh, please be gentle with her," she cried. "She does not know what she is doing." The psychological warfare was staggering. Even while cornered by undeniable financial proof, they defaulted to their primary weapon: invalidate the witness. If they dragged me out of this room kicking and screaming, every document on that table would be tainted by the visual of a hysterical woman resisting medical intervention. The lead orderly reached out his large hand, clamping down on my right shoulder. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, practiced drone. "We need you to come with us, quietly." I did not flinch. I did not pull away. A physical struggle is exactly what Hector needed to validate the psychiatric hold. I turned my head, looking directly into the orderly's eyes. My voice remained perfectly level, matching his clinical detachment. "Take your hand off me," I stated. He tightened his grip. "We have authorization from your next of kin, ma'am. You are under a 72-hour observation mandate." I reached into the inner pocket of my charcoal blazer. My movements were slow, telegraphed, ensuring no one mistook my action for a threat. I pulled out a crisp white envelope and held it up, pressing it flat against the chest of the lead orderly. He glanced down. He did not release my shoulder, but his eyes scanned the bold red lettering printed across the top of the document. "Read it," I instructed. The man hesitated, then pulled his hand back, breaking physical contact. He took the envelope and opened the flap, sliding out a 3-page medical document. "I am a compliance auditor for St. Jude Regional Medical Center," I announced, my voice carrying across the silent dining room. "I know exactly how an involuntary psychiatric hold is initiated in the state of New Mexico. I know it requires an emergency petition filed by a family member citing imminent danger, and I know how to preemptively neutralize it." I looked at Hector, his outstretched arm slowly lowered to his side, the manic energy draining from his posture. "What you are holding," I said, turning back to the transport team, "is a comprehensive psychological evaluation. It was conducted yesterday afternoon by Dr. Helen Mercer, the Chief of Psychiatry at St. Jude. It includes a full cognitive assessment and a toxicology screen. The evaluation certifies that I am of sound mind, completely lucid, and displaying 0 symptoms of psychosis, mania, or paranoia." The lead orderly flipped to the second page, his eyes scanning the detailed clinical notes and the prominent hospital seal stamped at the bottom. "Furthermore," I added, my tone hardening into a sharp, sterile edge, "that document contains an active medical power of attorney. It legally revokes Hector and Sylvia Garcia's status as my next of kin regarding all healthcare decisions. It transfers that authority to my Aunt Teresa." The orderly looked at Teresa. She stood beside me, her posture rigid, her eyes cold and unwavering. "The emergency petition Mr. Garcia filed this morning is legally void," I stated. "You are currently attempting to detain a pregnant woman against her will based on a fraudulent medical claim. If you touch me again with that restraint belt, I will file a civil lawsuit against your transport company for assault, false imprisonment, and medical malpractice before you even reach the parking lot." The lead orderly stared at the hospital seal. He was a contractor hired to transport a volatile patient, not a soldier willing to absorb a massive corporate lawsuit. He folded the evaluation, sliding it back into the envelope. He handed it back to me. "My apologies, ma'am," he said, his professional drone replaced by genuine caution. "There seems to be a conflict in the authorization paperwork. We will stand down." He signaled his partner. The 2 men turned around and walked out of the sunroom, the heavy oak doors swinging shut behind them. The silence returned, settling over the room like a thick layer of dust. The final desperate maneuver had failed. Hector was completely disarmed. He had no more smoke bombs. He had no more deflections. He stood behind his chair, stripped of his tailored armor, exposed as a cornered, terrified fraud. Richard, the head of Crescent Ridge Capital, watched the medical team exit. He did not blink. He turned his dark, predatory gaze back to the manila folders resting on the linen tablecloth. He picked up the reconstructed thermal receipts and the IP address logs. He aligned the edges of the paper, tapping them against the table with a sharp, rhythmic thud. Julian, Richard said, his voice echoing through the quiet room. Julian lifted his face from his hands. He looked broken. The pristine illusion of his pedigree and his perfect future had shattered, leaving a hollow, bewildered man in an expensive navy suit. "Yes, sir," he whispered. "Gather these documents," Richard ordered, sliding the folders across the table. "Call the legal department. Instruct them to freeze all personal and corporate assets tied to Hector Garcia immediately." Julian nodded, his hands trembling as he reached for the manila folders. Hector panicked. The reality of federal ruin crashed down upon him. "Richard, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "We can handle this privately. I can liquidate the commercial properties in Albuquerque. I can repay the $300,000. With interest. Do not call the lawyers. We are family." Family, Richard repeated the word, tasting like poison on his tongue. "You forged my firm's financial records. You stole capital from my investors, and you attempted to institutionalize your own pregnant daughter to cover your tracks. You are not family, Hector. You are a liability." Sylvia began to hyperventilate, clutching her chest, her monogrammed handkerchief crumpled in her fist. "Richard, you must understand," she gasped. "We were desperate. The real estate market crashed. We were trying to protect our legacy. Eleanor was supposed to help us. She owed us." I looked at my mother. The sheer magnitude of her narcissism was breathtaking. She believed I owed them my credit, my future, and my sanity to subsidize their failed vanity projects. "You do not have a legacy, Sylvia," I said, my voice dropping to a low, icy register. "You have a shadow corporation and a federal indictment." Julian finished packing the documents into his briefcase. He closed the brass latches with a definitive snap. He stood up, looking at me. His eyes were red-rimmed, swimming with a complex mixture of guilt, sorrow, and desperate hope. "Eleanor," he said, taking a step around the table. He reached out his hand, hovering in the space between us. "I am so sorry. I should have asked you. I should have looked at the ultrasound. I let them manipulate me. Please, we can fix this. We will press charges together. My father will handle the legal fees. We can still be a family." This was the emotional climax, the grand romantic apology, the wealthy fiancé realizing his mistake and offering his resources to save the day. But I did not want to be saved, and I definitely did not want his resources. I looked at Julianne's outstretched hand. I did not reach out to meet it. I pulled a fourth manila folder from my tote bag, a thin, pristine file I had kept hidden until this exact moment. "I am not pressing charges with you, Julian," I said, stepping back. I handed the thin folder directly to Richard. "What is this?" Richard asked, his brow furrowing as he opened the cover. "That is a drafted whistleblower report addressed to the Securities and Exchange Commission." I replied, "It outlines a detailed history of gross negligence and failure to perform due diligence by Crescent Ridge Capital. Your firm allowed unsecured lines of credit to be drawn by a shadow corporation for 3 years without executing a single verification audit." Richard's jaw locked. The CFO sitting beside him went rigid. "If Hector Garcia stole $300,000 from your investors," Richard I continued, "that is your problem. But the $450,000 of defaulted commercial debt currently anchored to my identity is my problem, and it exists because your firm failed to secure its own capital." I looked at Julian, then back to his father. "You will absorb the shadow debt I stated, my tone absolute. You will clear the EIN attached to my misspelled name. You will repair the damage to my credit profile within 7 business days. If you attempt to hold me financially liable for Hector's fraud, I will file that report with the SEC and trigger a federal investigation into your internal accounting practices." Richard stared at the whistleblower draft. He recognized a checkmate when he saw one. He closed the folder and gave a single, sharp nod. "It will be handled," he said. I turned to Julian. The apology was dead in his throat. He looked at me, realizing I was not a victim waiting for a rescue. I was an auditor, closing out a hostile account. "There is no we, Julian," I said. "You left my ring on the counter. Do not ever contact me again. I turned my back on the head table. I took Teresa's arm. We walked out of the sunroom, leaving the wreckage of 2 families burning behind us. But as we stepped into the marble lobby, my phone vibrated in my pocket. A text message from an unknown number. You think you won. Watch your back. The conflict was not over. Hector was backed into a corner, but a cornered animal is the most dangerous kind. What was he planning to do with the remaining 18 hours before the FBI warrant cleared? The drafted whistleblower report sat on the pristine white tablecloth. Richard stared at the bold black letters printed across the top margin. The head of Crescent Ridge Capital did not move. He was a man accustomed to holding the leverage in every negotiation. He bought struggling companies and dismantled them for parts. He intimidated rivals with silence. But sitting in the sunroom of the Santa Fe Country Club, he found himself trapped by a 31-year-old hospital auditor holding a few sheets of paper. He understood the mechanics of my threat. If I filed that report with the Securities and Exchange Commission, his firm would face a federal inquiry. The investigators would freeze his assets, pull his internal communications, and uncover the glaring holes in his oversight protocols. The resulting fines and the reputational damage would cost him tens of millions. Compared to that, a $450,000 shadow debt was a rounding error. Richard raised his hand and brought his palm down hard against the table. The crystal glasses rattled. The silver cutlery chimed a discordant note. He turned his dark, predatory focus away from me and aimed it directly at my father. You stole from my firm, Richard said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. You forged my internal documents to bypass our security checks. And then you brought me to a country club to watch you frame an innocent woman for your crimes. Hector shrank back into his chair. The tailored gray suit hung off his frame like borrowed clothing. He opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. He looked toward Sylvia, searching for a lifeline. Sylvia offered nothing. She sat rigid, her eyes fixed on the spilled mimosa pooling near her plate. The tragic matriarch performance had dissolved, leaving only the terrified reality of a woman facing federal prison. Julian stood up. His chair scraped sharply against the hardwood floor. The reality of the last 48 hours crashed over him. He looked at the reconstructed thermal receipts. He looked at the IP address logs. Then he looked at the SEC folder sitting in front of his father. He finally understood the architecture of the deception. He had allowed my parents to orchestrate a surgical strike on our relationship, and he had played his assigned role perfectly. Eleanor, he whispered. Tears welled in his eyes, blurring his vision. His face collapsed, twisting into a mask of sudden, horrific realization. The pristine illusion of his perfect life was burning to the ground. He stepped around the table, closing the distance between us. My God, Julian, said his voice breaking. I am so sorry. We can fix this, Eleanor. We will press charges against them together. My father has the best corporate attorneys in the state. They will handle everything. I will handle everything. Please. This was the payoff. This was the moment a different woman might have collapsed into his arms, grateful for the protection of wealth and influence. He was offering me a shield. He was offering to restore the wedding, the future, and the security. I did not smile. I did not soften my posture. I felt zero grace for the man standing in front of me. I looked at his tailored navy jacket and his expensive leather shoes. I remembered the cold, empty tone of his voice on the phone when he canceled our life together from the driver's seat of his car. There is no we, Julian, I said. The words hung in the air, sharp and definitive. He flinched as if I had struck him. You did not ask me a single question. I continued, my voice steady and hollow. You did not ask to see my medical records. You did not ask to speak to my doctor. You listened to a lie, and you believed I was a deceitful gold digger scheming to trap you. You walked into our kitchen and left my engagement ring sitting on the quartz counter. You do not get to play the hero now. You do not get to be outraged on my behalf. But they manipulated me, Julian pleaded, reaching a hand out toward my arm. They gave you an exit, I corrected, stepping out of his reach. and you took it because you value your portfolio more than you value my word. I turned my attention back to Richard. The corporate shark was watching the exchange, analyzing the shifted power dynamic. You have your instructions, Richard, I said. Clear my shadow debt. Erase the corporate entity attached to my misspelled name. You have 7 business days before I drop that file in the mail. You will clean up Hector's mess because your accountants were too lazy to catch it 3 years ago. Richard did not argue. He offered a single, curt nod. The transaction was finalized. Checkmate. I turned my back on the head table. I placed my hand on Teresa's elbow, guiding her toward the heavy oak doors. We walked out of the sunroom without looking back. The silence in the dining room stretched behind us, heavy and suffocating. We crossed the marble lobby and stepped through the glass entry doors. The desert heat hit my face, washing away the sterile, air-conditioned chill of the country club. The unmarked white transport van was gone. The medical team had retreated, leaving the parking lot empty, except for the rows of luxury vehicles baking in the sun. I unlocked my sedan. Teresa slid into the passenger seat, resting her purse on her lap. She let out a long, slow breath. Her hands rested on her knees, steady and calm. You secured the perimeter, she said softly. I started the engine. I secured the debt, I replied. But Hector is still walking around with a loaded weapon. I pulled my phone from my blazer pocket. The screen displayed the anonymous text message I received just as we exited the dining room. You think you won. Watch your back. A number was untraceable, a burner application used to mask the origin. But I knew the sender. Hector was stripped of his dignity and his social standing, but he still possessed a primal, desperate instinct for survival. The Crescent Ridge attorneys were going to freeze his digital assets within the hour. The Federal Bureau of Investigation would likely secure a warrant by tomorrow morning. He had a narrow operational window to destroy the only physical evidence tying him directly to the offshore accounts. The reconstructed thermal receipts were in my possession. The IP logs were secured on my encrypted drive. But the original 2015 ledgers, the books proving the historical pattern of his embezzlement, were sitting in a rusted filing cabinet at Teresa's duplex. Teresa, I said, putting the car into gear, did you lock the deadbolt when we left your house this morning? She looked at me, her brow furrowing. I locked the front door. The deadbolt requires a key from the outside. Why? I handed her my phone displaying the text message. Hector is cornered, I explained. He knows Richard is going to hand the files over to the authorities. He knows your ledgers established the precedent for the wire fraud. He cannot touch the digital evidence. But paper burns, Teresa. The color drained from her cheeks. The ledgers, she whispered. I pressed the accelerator, merging onto the main road leading away from the country club. We were 3 miles from her neighborhood. If Hector slipped out the back door of the sunroom while Richard was calling his legal team, he had a 10-minute head start. My father was a man who cared deeply about optics. He avoided manual labor. He hired contractors to fix his plumbing and accountants to hide his theft. But fear strips away the polished veneer. A man facing 10 years in a federal penitentiary will break a window and strike a match without hesitation. The drive felt agonizingly slow. Every red light felt like a trap. Every slow-moving truck in the right lane felt like a deliberate obstacle. My hands gripped the steering wheel, testing the limits of the leather casing. We turned onto the cracked pavement of Teresa's street. The overgrown lawns and chain-link fences blurred past the windows. I navigated the final curve, approaching her dead-end lot. A silver Mercedes was parked on the dirt shoulder 2 houses down from her property. It sat at a crooked angle, the front tire resting on the curb. The engine was off, but a thin wisp of exhaust still lingered near the tailpipe. Hector was already here. I stopped my sedan behind the rusted pickup truck in Teresa's driveway. I turned off the ignition. The desert wind rattled the faded wind chime hanging from her porch awning. Stay in the car, I told Teresa, my voice dropping to a low whisper. Lock the doors. Call the police. Tell them there is an intruder actively trespassing at your residence. Eleanor, she protested, reaching for the door handle, he is desperate. He will hurt you. "He is a coward," I replied, "and cowards only fight when they think no one is watching." I stepped out of the vehicle, leaving my heavy tote bag on the seat. The midday sun beat down on my shoulders. I walked up the concrete path, the dry weeds brushing against my ankles. The front door was intact. The heavy brass chain was still engaged, holding the wood flush against the frame. I moved quietly, stepping off the path and navigating the narrow dirt walkway leading to the backyard. The side of the duplex was cast in deep shadow. A chain-link gate hung open, the latch broken. I heard the sound of shattering glass before I reached the corner of the building, a sharp, brittle crash, followed by the heavy thud of a blunt object striking wood. I crept along the stucco wall, holding my breath. I peered around the edge of the structure into the overgrown backyard. Hector stood on the small concrete patio. He had discarded his tailored gray suit jacket. His silk tie hung loose around his neck. His pristine white shirt was stained with sweat and dirt. He held a heavy iron garden spade in his right hand. The glass pane of Teresa's back door lay in jagged pieces across the concrete. Hector reached through the broken window, blindly searching for the internal deadbolt. His arm scraped against a shard of glass, tearing the fabric of his sleeve, drawing a thick line of blood across his forearm. He did not seem to notice the pain. His movements were frantic, driven by pure, unadulterated panic. He found the latch. The deadbolt clicked open. He twisted the brass knob and shoved the door inward. It hit the interior wall with a violent slam. He stepped over the broken glass, disappearing into the dim labyrinth of cardboard boxes and old newspapers. He was inside the archive. He was searching for the match. The crunch of broken glass under my flats was the only sound in the dim duplex. The living room was a maze of deep shadows and stagnant air. Hector tore through the cardboard boxes like a starving animal searching for scraps. Dust motes danced in the narrow shafts of sunlight, piercing through the shattered back door. He threw a stack of municipal tax returns over his shoulder. The papers scattered across the faded linoleum. He found the heavy plastic tote labeled 2015. He ripped the lid off, throwing it against the wall. He reached into his trousers and produced a silver butane lighter. His thumb rested on the spark wheel, ready to ignite the evidence. "You cannot burn a cloud server, Hector," I said. My voice cut through the stagnant room, low and unhurried. He froze. He turned his head, his chest heaving with exertion. Sweat dripped down his collar, staining his pristine white shirt. His silk tie hung loose, an unraveling noose around his neck. I stood in the doorway, blocking his only exit. Teresa and I scanned every single page of those ledgers. Last night, I lied. We uploaded the high-resolution files to an encrypted hospital database. I secured the external backups in a safety deposit box this morning. You are holding worthless paper. It was a bluff. The physical ledgers inside that plastic tote were the only existing copies in the world. If he struck that lighter, the historical precedent for his wire fraud would turn to ash. But men who build their entire lives on deception are inherently vulnerable to a confident lie. They expect everyone else to operate with the same calculated ruthlessness. Hector stared at the silver lighter in his hand. His thumb hovered over the metal wheel. The hesitation cost him his freedom. A high-pitched wail pierced the quiet neighborhood air. The sound multiplied, layering into a chorus of approaching sirens. Teresa had stayed in the locked sedan and called emergency dispatch. Red and blue strobe lights swept across the heavy blackout curtains, illuminating the dust hanging in the air. Hector dropped the lighter. It clattered against the linoleum. He did not run. He did not fight the officers when they entered through the broken door with their weapons drawn. They secured his wrists in steel cuffs and marched him out to the cracked sidewalk. Seeing the polished real estate developer pushed into the back of a police cruiser, covered in dust and sweat, cemented the reality of the day. The severance was final. I stood on the dead grass and thought back to the moment I walked out of the country club dining room earlier that morning. Julian had reached for my hand, his eyes begging for a reprieve. I had stepped back, looking at the man I almost married. "You did not protect me, Julian," I had told him. "You protected your portfolio. We are done." I took Teresa's arm and we walked out of the private dining room, leaving both families sitting in a silence so heavy it felt suffocating. As we had walked through the parking lot, the two men from the psychiatric transport van had stepped forward, looking confused by our unescorted exit. I handed them a copy of my hospital identification and Dr. Mercer's independent psychological evaluation I had preemptively completed. "The patient you are looking for is inside," I told them coldly. We drove away as the sirens of consequence, metaphorically, began to wail. Now the real sirens were fading into the distance, taking my father to a county holding cell. The weekend ended, but the corporate machinery of Crescent Ridge Capital was just waking up. Monday morning brought the swift, clinical execution of corporate survival. Crescent Ridge Capital did not handle the situation quietly. Richard was a predator who had allowed a parasite to feed on his accounts for years. Terrified of the drafted SEC whistleblower report I held over his head, he moved with terrifying speed. He ordered his accounting division to scrub the liability. By Tuesday afternoon, a courier arrived at my apartment complex. He handed me a thick legal envelope bearing the Crescent Ridge embossed seal. Inside were notarized documents confirming the firm had absorbed the shadow debt in full. Richard utilized his internal legal division to decouple my identity from the forged employer identification number. They zeroed out the balances. My consumer credit profile was restored, returning to a flawless rating in a matter of days. Richard cleared his firm's liability to protect his own kingdom from federal scrutiny. But Richard did not stop at financial restructuring. He demanded retribution for the breach of his security. He compiled Hector's forged loan applications, the IP address logs extracted from the router, and the reconstructed thermal receipts. He did not file a local police report in Albuquerque. He bypassed the municipal detectives and handed the entire dossier directly to the regional office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The true crime thriller had reached its peak. The paper trail I built block by block was now resting on the desks of federal prosecutors. Wire fraud, identity theft, and bank fraud fall under strict federal jurisdiction. Hector was transferred from the local county lockup to a federal detention center before his attorneys could even arrange a bail hearing. The dust began to settle. I sat at my kitchen island drinking a glass of cold water. My hospital suspension was lifted, my security clearance active. I placed a hand over my stomach, feeling the quiet flutter of the life growing inside me. The storm seemed to have broken. The fraudulent debt was gone. My credit was mine again. But toxic ecosystems do not simply evaporate when the primary predator is caged. They mutate. The remaining parasites search for a new host. My laptop screen illuminated with an incoming email notification. The sender was Aaron Garcia, my older brother. Aaron was the golden child of the Garcia family. He operated as a vice president in Hector's development firm, driving European sports cars and living in a downtown penthouse heavily subsidized by the company payroll. Aaron had not spoken to me in 3 years, viewing my modest auditing career as an embarrassment to the family brand. The subject line of his email consisted of 2 words: asset freeze. I opened the message. The federal government had just seized Hector's holding accounts, placing a sweeping injunction on the entire corporate portfolio. Aaron's trust fund, his operational capital, and his corporate credit cards were locked down by the FBI. He was collateral damage in the federal sweep. Aaron was not writing to apologize for our parents' behavior. He was not asking about my health or my pregnancy. His email was a frantic, aggressive demand. He ordered me to formally drop the identity theft charges. He claimed my cooperation would allow the prosecutors to unfreeze his specific trust accounts. The financial rot ran deeper than Hector and Sylvia. Aaron was watching his luxury lifestyle evaporate, and his panic was turning into rage directed entirely at me. The brother who had ignored my existence was now preparing to launch his own offensive to protect his inheritance. The concrete parking structure of the hospital was empty when I walked out through the sliding glass doors. The evening air felt brittle and thin. I walked toward my sedan, ready to drive home and rest. A sleek black sports car sat idling directly behind my parking space, blocking my exit. The engine released a low, guttural hum. The driver door swung open. Aaron stepped onto the pavement. My older brother wore a tailored charcoal suit that mirrored the expensive wardrobe our father favored. But the confident, arrogant swagger was gone. His silk tie hung loose, his hair was unkempt, his eyes carried a frantic, feral shine illuminated by the harsh, overhead fluorescent lights. He slammed his car door shut, the sharp, metallic sound echoing through the empty, concrete levels. He marched toward me, his expensive leather shoes slapping against the ground. He did not ask how I was feeling. He did not ask about the child growing inside me. He stopped 2 feet away, invading my personal space with hostile intent. "You are going to call the federal prosecutor tomorrow morning," Aaron ordered, his voice vibrating with raw panic. "You are going to sign a sworn affidavit stating the identity theft was a misunderstanding. You will tell them you gave Hector permission to use your name for that consulting firm." I looked at his clenched fists. I looked at the gold luxury watch resting on his left wrist. "I am not perjuring myself for a man who tried to institutionalize me, Aaron," I replied, my tone flat and unyielding. Aaron stepped closer, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "You do not understand what you are doing, Eleanor. The Federal Bureau of Investigation placed a sweeping injunction on the entire Garcia portfolio. My trust fund is locked. My corporate credit cards are declining at the grocery store. My construction sites are shut down because I cannot meet the vendor payroll. You are bankrupting me to settle a petty grudge." The profound selfishness of his statement hung in the cold air. He viewed my stolen identity and the $450,000 of shadow debt as a petty grudge. He only cared that his luxury lifestyle was evaporating. "You are a vice president in his firm," I said, watching his rapid, shallow breathing. "You knew he was moving stolen capital. You stood by and watched him frame Teresa 10 years ago. You watched him forge my signature. You chose the sports car over your sister." Aaron raised a trembling finger, pointing it inches from my face. "If you do not drop the charges, I will hire the most vicious civil litigators in the state. I will sue you for defamation. I will bury you in legal fees until you are living on the street. You will not have a dime left to raise that kid." He turned around and walked back to his vehicle. He shifted into gear and sped away, leaving the sharp, acrid scent of high-octane exhaust suspended in the parking garage. I unlocked my sedan and sat behind the steering wheel. My pulse remained steady. I did not feel intimidated by his threats. I felt a cold, clinical curiosity. If Aaron was desperate enough to ambush a pregnant woman in a dark parking structure, his trust fund was not just a passive savings account. It was a repository. I drove home and opened my laptop. I accessed the public municipal database for Bernalillo County. I pulled the property tax records and the commercial development filings for Aaron's specific construction projects. I cross-referenced the dates of his land acquisitions with the routing logs I had extracted from Hector's router. The pattern emerged within an hour. The unsecured credit line stolen from Crescent Ridge Capital did not just sit in Hector's offshore accounts. The funds were cycled back into the domestic banking system, disguised as anonymous angel investments funding Aaron's luxury condominiums. Aaron was not just collateral damage. He was the primary beneficiary of the wire fraud. He was laundering the embezzled money through concrete and steel. I compiled the property records, the corresponding date stamps, and the matched financial figures into a digital dossier. I drafted a concise supplementary email and sent the encrypted file directly to the lead federal prosecutor assigned to Hector's case. The federal justice system does not operate on emotion. It operates on a cold, methodical timeline. 2 months passed. The high desert autumn settled over New Mexico, turning the cottonwood leaves a brilliant gold. The air grew sharp and crisp. The fallout arrived on a Tuesday morning. It was clinically merciless and swift. I sat in my office at the hospital drinking a cup of herbal tea. The local news channel played on the small television mounted in the break room. The broadcast cut to live helicopter footage circling the exclusive gated subdivision in Albuquerque. A fleet of dark sport utility vehicles blocked the circular cobblestone driveway of my parents' estate. Federal agents wearing tactical windbreakers swarmed the pristine manicured lawn. They carried empty cardboard evidence boxes into the grand foyer and carried them out filled with financial documents, computer hard drives, and physical ledgers. The news anchor read the breaking bulletin. Hector and Sylvia Garcia were indicted by a federal grand jury on multiple felony counts, including wire fraud, identity theft, bank fraud, and money laundering. The government executed a sweeping asset forfeiture warrant. The helicopter camera zoomed in as a flatbed tow truck hauled Hector's silver Mercedes away from the curb. The sprawling stucco home was seized to pay restitution to the defrauded creditors. Their country club memberships were revoked. The mahogany desk where my father had plotted my ruin was disassembled and carried out in pieces. The illusion of their untouchable success was stripped bare, broadcast to the entire city. The following evening, my cell phone rang. I did not recognize the incoming number. I answered the call, pressing the speaker to my ear. An automated operator voice informed me I had a prepaid call originating from the Bernalillo County Correctional Facility. I pressed the keypad to accept the connection. "Eleanor," a voice whispered. It was Sylvia. Her tone was stripped of its usual polished country club resonance. The practiced theatrical fragility was gone, replaced by raw, unfiltered desperation. The harsh metallic echo of a holding cell reverberated in the background. "Eleanor, please," she sobbed, her breath hitching in her throat. "The conditions in here are horrific. They took my jewelry. They took the house. You have to call the judge. You have to tell them you forgive us. We are your parents, Eleanor. Family protects family." She was still attempting to use the same biological guilt she had weaponized my entire life. She wanted me to act as her shield. I listened to her weeping. I felt no triumph. I felt no joy. I felt the sterile, quiet satisfaction of a balanced equation. "I am an auditor, Sylvia," I replied, my voice devoid of any emotional inflection. "I do not protect the fraud. I protect the ledger." I pulled the phone away from my ear and ended the call. The connection lasted exactly 4 seconds. It was not an act of revenge. It was an act of absolute compliance with the reality they had built. The final loose end arrived at my apartment complex 2 days later. A delivery driver knocked on my front door holding a sprawling, extravagant floral arrangement. It was a massive display of rare white orchids and imported lilies housed in a heavy crystal vase. The scent was cloying, thick, and overpowering, filling the narrow hallway with a suffocating perfume. The driver handed me a thick parchment envelope, sealed with dark blue wax. I carried the heavy vase into my kitchen and set it on the quartz island, the exact spot where Julian had abandoned his platinum engagement ring. I broke the wax seal on the envelope and unfolded the heavy cardstock. The handwriting belonged to Julian. The letter was 3 pages long, a frantic, rambling manifesto of regret and longing. He wrote that his father had finalized the absorption of the shadow debt. He wrote that Crescent Ridge was safe. He begged for a second chance. He promised to buy a house in Santa Fe to support the baby, to spend the rest of his life proving his loyalty. He asked me to wear his ring again. He believed a grand gesture and an expensive bouquet could erase the moment he looked at me with disgust and threatened me with federal prison. He believed wealth was a universal eraser. I folded the letter, sliding it back into the parchment envelope. I picked up the heavy crystal vase. The orchids trembled as I carried the arrangement out my front door and walked down the concrete stairs. I bypassed the recycling bins and walked directly to the large commercial metal dumpster sitting at the edge of the resident parking lot. I lifted the heavy glass vase and dropped it inside. The crystal shattered against the rusted metal bottom with a loud, satisfying crash. The rare white orchids vanished into the refuse, mixed with discarded coffee grounds and junk mail. I tossed the parchment envelope in right behind them. I walked back up the stairs to my quiet, sunlit apartment. The air inside smelled clean, free of cigar smoke, heavy perfume, and toxic lies. The enablers, the narcissists, and the cowards had faced their inescapable consequences. The rot had been completely excised from my life. The high desert winter gave way to a brilliant, brief spring. The thick snowpack resting on the Sangre de Cristo peaks melted, feeding the dry riverbeds twisting through the valley. My belly grew taut and heavy, carrying the quiet, steady rhythm of a new life. I went into labor on a Tuesday evening, just as the sky turned a deep, bruised purple. The delivery room at St. Jude Regional Medical Center was an oasis of clinical calm. There were no hovering grandmothers staging photographs for social media. There were no arrogant men pacing the hallways demanding updates. The room contained only the rhythmic digital beep of the fetal monitor, the quiet encouragement of the nursing staff, and Teresa holding my left hand. Clara arrived just before midnight. Her first cry was a sharp, demanding sound that filled the sterile space, cutting through the silence. I held her warm, fragile body against my chest, feeling the rapid flutter of her tiny heart. She was perfect. She belonged to no one else. 2 weeks later, the illusion of total peace fractured. A sharp, rapid knock sounded at my apartment door, shattering the quiet morning routine. I carried Clara in my arms and peered through the peephole. A man wearing a beige windbreaker stood on the welcome mat, holding a thick manila envelope. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. "You have been served," he muttered, shoving the envelope toward my chest, before turning away and retreating down the concrete stairs. I recognized the return address printed in embossed navy ink immediately. Crescent Ridge Capital, Legal Division. I carried the heavy parcel to the kitchen island, resting it on the cool quartz surface. I placed Clara gently into her bassinet. I tore the flap open and pulled out a formal legal petition filed in the Bernalillo County Family Court. Julian was listed as the primary plaintiff. The document outlined a demand for a mandatory genetic paternity test, followed by a formal request for shared physical guardianship and joint legal decision-making authority. A cold wave of dread washed over my skin, raising the hairs on my arms. This was not a gesture of sudden paternal love. It was a hostile acquisition strategy directed by his father, Richard. The Crescent Ridge dynasty operated on bloodline principles. They viewed a potential biological heir as a corporate asset, requiring strict management and control. Richard had neutralized the federal threat regarding my parents' wire fraud, but his towering pride demanded he retain leverage over my existence. They intended to use their limitless financial resources to drag me through years of grueling litigation, burying me in attorney fees until I surrendered control of my daughter. Fighting corporate billionaires in family court is a war of attrition. They bank on the opponent running out of stamina and capital, but an auditor never signs a contract without reading the peripheral clauses. I walked into my home office. My security clearance at the medical center was restored, and I had resumed my position managing compliance reports from a remote terminal. I unlocked my lower filing cabinet and retrieved the final execution agreement Richard sent over 6 months ago when his accountants zeroed out my shadow debt. When the Crescent Ridge fixers drafted that settlement, they were terrified of the whistleblower report I had threatened to send to the Securities and Exchange Commission. They focused entirely on indemnifying their accounting division from federal oversight. They required my signature on a strict non-disclosure covenant binding me to silence regarding their vast institutional negligence. I had agreed to sign their covenant under one specific, non-negotiable condition. I mandated the inclusion of a specialized family law rider. The following morning, I scheduled a secure video conference with the lead counsel for Crescent Ridge. I sat at my desk, wearing a sharp blazer, looking into the camera lens. The legal representative appeared on my screen, sitting in a sleek, glass-walled boardroom. He wore a condescending smirk, clearly prepared to bully a single mother into a predatory visitation framework. Miss Garcia, the counsel, began, his tone dripping with patronizing faux sympathy. My client is prepared to offer generous monthly child support in exchange for standard visitation rights. We strongly advise you to accept this preliminary framework before we file the exhaustive discovery motions. We will subpoena your employment records, your psychological history, and your financial status. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch at the threats. I leaned forward, resting my hands flat on my desk. I suggest you open the finalized debt absorption contract your firm drafted last November, I instructed. Turn to page 14, paragraph 4, subsection C. The litigator frowned, typing rapidly on his mechanical keyboard. His eyes scanned the digital document on his secondary monitor. The arrogant smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a rigid mask of professional panic. That specific clause dictates a reciprocal exchange of rights, I stated calmly. Julian formally cited his belief that he was not the biological father as his primary reason for abandoning our engagement. I embedded a legal stipulation acknowledging that stated belief. The clause legally terminates his paternal rights and waives his ability to ever contest guardianship in the future. I agreed to sign your non-disclosure covenant protecting Richard from federal scrutiny only in exchange for Julian's preemptive relinquishment of this child. The attorney stared blankly at the screen. He realized the fatal error his department had committed. Corporate lawyers rarely scrutinize family law riders buried deep within financial settlements. They had traded a grandchild for corporate immunity. If you pursue this family court petition, I continued, you are breaching the foundational terms of our settlement. That breach immediately nullifies my non-disclosure agreement. If Julian wants to fight for weekends, I will mail the whistleblower report to the federal regulators this afternoon. Decide what is more valuable to Richard, his money or his pride. The lawyer ended the video call without uttering another syllable. The screen faded to black. 3 hours later, an electronic notification from the county clerk confirmed the petition was voluntarily dismissed with prejudice. The final tether to that toxic dynasty was severed. The days shortened, fading into a warm, golden summer. Clara grew strong and observant with dark, curious eyes. We reside in a bright, airy apartment in Santa Fe, far removed from dark mahogany desks and the suffocating theater of country club deception. The air outside my window smells of rain and wild sagebrush. Every Sunday morning, the doorbell rings. Teresa arrives carrying a heavy foil-wrapped package of fresh, green chile tamales. Her posture is no longer bowed by the weight of unacknowledged shame. She holds Clara, rocking her gently near the open window, singing soft Spanish lullabies. She is no longer the erratic outcast of the Garcia family. She is the bedrock of a new one. I framed the thermal ultrasound picture. The original 12-week scan that triggered the collapse of the entire conspiracy now hangs above Clara's crib, enclosed in a simple wooden border. It serves as a daily visual reminder of the exact hour everything fractured and the precise moment my real life commenced. I did not get the ending the bridal magazines sell. I did not walk down an aisle in a white dress, and I did not marry into immense generational wealth. I gained something infinitely more durable. I acquired autonomy. I secured the unvarnished truth. No one dictates my narrative, manipulates my credit profile, or engineers my sanity anymore. The cycle of manipulation stops the moment you refuse to absorb the cost of their deception. If a relative ever tells you that you are a burden or attempts to forge your worth to cover their own failures, do not waste your breath screaming into the void. Read the fine print. Audit the history. Let the paperwork speak. Drop a comment below if you have ever had to build a case against your own toxic bloodline, and subscribe for more stories of quiet boundaries and precise justice. The truth about existing as the designated scapegoat within a toxic bloodline is that they only underestimate your intelligence until they can no longer afford the luxury of ignorance. For 31 years, my parents viewed my quiet compliance as a symptom of weakness. They looked at my modest apartment and my predictable auditing career and saw a convenient dumping ground for their own moral bankruptcies. They assumed a daughter trained to follow the rules would never possess the audacity to rewrite the rule book. But that is the fundamental miscalculation of arrogant people. They forget that the person tasked with carrying the emotional debt is also the person who learns how to read the underlying ledger. Hector and Sylvia traded their freedom for a desperate illusion. The federal sentencing hearing took place in a sterile courtroom in downtown Albuquerque late last autumn. I sat in the back row wearing a simple black sweater, watching the proceedings with the detached observation of a stranger. My father did not look like a titan of commercial real estate. Stripped of his tailored suits and his expensive imported cigars, he looked small, hollowed out by the crushing weight of federal sentencing guidelines. The judge did not care about his golf handicap or his curated charitable donations. The judge cared about wire fraud across state lines. When the gavel struck, condemning them both to lengthy terms in a minimum security federal penitentiary, Sylvia did not look back at the gallery. Her country club peers were absent. Her golden child son Aaron was absent, busy fighting his own civil asset forfeiture battles. They stood alone, shackled by the very deception they had engineered to maintain their pristine image. They are locked in a cage they constructed, brick by forged brick. Julian traded a family for a financial portfolio that ultimately fractured under the weight of his father's ruthless expectations. Richard did not forgive his son for bringing a monumental federal liability into the Crescent Ridge boardroom. Corporate sharks do not tolerate weakness in their succession plans. From what I read in the regional business journals, Richard forced Julian to resign from his executive vice president position shortly after the scandal concluded. Julian was reassigned to a meaningless advisory role in a satellite office hundreds of miles away from the primary seat of power. He chose the safety of his inheritance over the integrity of our partnership, and in the end, he lost his grip on both. He traded a life of genuine connection for a cold corner office where he will spend the next 3 decades trying to earn back the respect of a father who views him as a depreciating asset. You do not have to yell to be heard. You do not have to perform grief for people who engineered your pain. The silence that follows the excision of toxic enablers is not empty. It is spacious. It leaves room for the things that actually matter. Clara will grow up knowing the story of the thick blue folder. She will not hear it framed as a tragic tale of betrayal or a warning about the cruelty of the world. She will hear it as the exact moment the women in her family stopped absorbing the blame for the sins of erratic men. She will learn that loyalty is earned through consistent action, not demanded through biological extortion. Teresa regained her dignity. For 10 years, she existed as a ghost haunting the edges of a family that stole her reputation to cover their own tracks. Today, she sits at my dining table, sorting through colorful baby clothes and drinking dark roast coffee. The heavy spiral-bound ledgers from 2015 are gone, handed over to the federal prosecutors long ago. She no longer needs cardboard boxes to validate her sanity. Her truth is documented in the permanent court record. I regained my life. The hospital compliance software, the reconstructed thermal receipts, and the IP address logs served their purpose. The tools of my profession dismantled the architecture of my oppression. When I look around my sunlit apartment, I do not see the remnants of a shattered engagement. I see a sanctuary. The quartz kitchen island where the platinum ring once sat is now covered in baby bottles and stacks of unread novels. The air is light. The emotional gravity is manageable. I sleep through the night without waking up to phantom anxieties or manufactured crises. This piece is the ultimate return on investment. This is the final audit. That is the bottom line. It requires a terrifying leap of faith to stand up in a crowded room and place a manila folder onto a pristine linen tablecloth. It requires a bone-deep certainty to look at the people who gave you life and tell them you will no longer finance their lies. But the reward for that terrifying leap is a horizon free of shadows. If you are listening to this and recognizing the distinct, familiar patterns of your own toxic environment, I need you to understand something crucial. Manipulators rely on your empathy. They depend on your willingness to doubt your own perception. They will present you with forged realities and demand you accept them as gospel. They will use your compassion as a weapon against your best interests. Do not let them rush you into an emotional reaction. Panic is the environment where their deception thrives. When they escalate the pressure, you must decelerate your response. Take a step back. Analyze the discrepancies in their narrative. Look for the missing decimal points in their stories. There is always a structural flaw in a lie, because a lie requires constant maintenance to survive. The truth simply exists, requiring no ongoing effort. Your worth is not defined by the utility you provide to people who refuse to respect your boundaries. You are not a human shield for their mistakes. You are not a repository for their shame. Untangling your identity from their suffocating expectations is a painful, exhausting process. It requires you to mourn the parents, the siblings, or the partners you deserved, but never actually had. Grieving that phantom potential is the hardest phase of the extraction. But once you process that grief, the clarity that replaces it is unbreakable. Thank you for staying with me through the storm. Thank you for walking through the dark corridors, the quiet hospital rooms, and the tense country club dining rooms by my side. If my story helps you untangle your own worth from the people who tried to forge it, then every shredded piece of paper, every terrifying confrontation, and every sleepless night was worth the endurance. You hold the pen to your own ledger. Stay quiet when they expect you to scream. Stay sharp when they want you confused. And always keep the receipts. See you in the next one. The quietest hours of the night always bring a distinct kind of clarity. When I sit in the dim glow of the nursery, the only sound in the apartment is the soft, rhythmic breathing of my daughter Clara. In these still moments, holding her warm weight against my chest, the echoes of the past year fade into a low hum. The courtrooms, the shredded receipts, the sterile country club dining rooms, they all recede. What remains is a profound, almost terrifying realization about the true weight of the word family. Becoming a mother forces you to examine the blueprint of your own upbringing. You look at the foundation you were handed and must decide whether to build upon it or tear it down to the bedrock. For my entire life, I believed my parents, Hector and Sylvia, represented a specific brand of the traditional American family. They presented a flawless facade. They owned the sprawling stucco home in a gated subdivision. They attended the right charity galas, drove the imported cars, and projected the image of the successful, self-made patriarch and his devoted matriarch. In American culture, we are often conditioned to equate this kind of material accumulation with successful parenting. We confuse financial provision with family responsibility. But a roof paid for with stolen capital is just a very expensive trap. True family responsibility has very little to do with the zip code you raise your children in or the pedigree of the partner you push them to marry. It is rooted in the quiet, unglamorous work of emotional integrity. My parents failed not just because they committed federal wire fraud. They failed because they viewed their children not as autonomous human beings requiring guidance, but as raw materials to be harvested. They looked at my brother Aaron and saw an accomplice to launder their ambition. They looked at me and saw a pristine credit score and a convenient scapegoat. When we talk about traditional family structures, we often talk about duty. But duty must flow in both directions. The unspoken contract between parent and child relies entirely on fundamental fairness and radical honesty. A child relies on their parents to act as a mirror, reflecting a safe, accurate version of the world back to them. When Sylvia planted a forged medical file on my kitchen counter, attempting to convince me my own body was broken, she shattered that mirror. She weaponized my trust to protect her own vanity. Raising Clara has taught me that emotional awareness is the most critical asset you can pass down to the next generation. Emotional awareness means recognizing your child's fears and joys as valid, separate entities from your own desires. It means resisting the urge to manipulate their reality to serve your comfort. If Clara ever makes a devastating mistake, I will not teach her to construct a shadow corporation or forge a digital paper trail to hide from the consequences. I will teach her to sit in the uncomfortable light of accountability. Accountability is the only soil where genuine resilience grows. We live in a society that often rewards the loudest voice in the room, the slickest presentation, the most aggressive maneuver. But long-term guidance requires teaching a child the value of the fine print. It requires showing them that character is defined by what you do when the security cameras are turned off and the bank accounts are frozen. I want Clara to understand that her worth is inherent. It is not tied to a corporate merger, a country club membership, or the approval of people who view love as a transactional currency. Honesty within a family is not merely the absence of lies. It is the active, daily practice of transparency. It means allowing your children to see your flaws without burdening them with the responsibility of fixing them. Hector and Sylvia could not bear the shame of their own financial failures, so they forced their sister and their daughter to carry the debt. They violated the most sacred rule of the family structure. Parents are meant to shield their children from the fire, not use them as kindling to keep themselves warm. Breaking a generational cycle of abuse and manipulation is a lonely, exhausting endeavor. It requires you to mourn the family you deserved while simultaneously fighting the family you were actually given. But the reward for that excruciating labor is a clean slate. When I look at the framed 12-week ultrasound picture hanging above Clara's crib, I do not see the catalyst for a criminal indictment. I see the exact moment the inheritance of deceit was permanently severed. I see a promise kept. The process of auditing your own bloodline is never easy, but it is the only way to ensure the rot does not spread to the roots of the next generation. If you are navigating the heavy work of untangling your own worth from a toxic environment, if you are learning how to set the quiet boundaries that protect your peace, you are not alone. There is a community of people learning how to read the ledger and reclaim their narrative. Drop a comment below to share the lessons you are passing down to the next generation, and subscribe to Aura Vengeance. Together, we can continue to explore the intricate, sometimes painful dynamics of family justice and the power of the undeniable truth. As I lay Clara down in her crib and pull the soft blanket over her shoulders, I watch the moonlight filter through the blinds, casting long, shifting shadows across the floorboards. The apartment is safe, the locks are secure, and the future is an open, unwritten page. Yet the past never truly vanishes. It simply changes its shape. We all inherit a ledger from the people who raised us, filled with debts we did not accrue and assets we must carefully appraise. The question is not whether you were handed a corrupted balance sheet. The question is what you will choose to write on the next blank line. When you look into the mirror of your own life, recognizing the quiet choices you make when no one else is watching, ask yourself, are you building a foundation that will hold firm in the storm? Or are you just arranging the shadows to look like a home?